Today's story is about a crime so horrific that a judge handed down a sentence that had never been given before in Australian history. This story is exceptionally graphic. As such, viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload once or twice every week. So if that's of interest to you, please offer to spray the like button's face with sunscreen, but instead use bear spray. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. Before we get into today's story, I want to talk to you about today's sponsor, Honey. Are you tired of paying full price for your bear spray? Me too. That's why I started using Honey. Honey, like bear spray, is one of those things that you don't realize you need until you have it. Then you're like, how did I ever live without this thing? Honey, which is completely free, automatically scours the internet for discount codes and coupons for nearly anything you happen to be shopping for online. It's genius. Use Honey, save money. And just think, with all that honey money you're going to be saving, you can finally upgrade from bear spray to dinosaur spray. So if you want to be like me and continue to bring the good fight to the like button, go ahead and add Honey for free to your browser by going to joinhoney.com/ballen. Okay, let's get into today's story. In 1955, Catherine Knight had the misfortune of being born into a highly dysfunctional and abusive household. Not only was she badly mistreated by her alcoholic parents and cruel older siblings, she was also scorned by the people who lived in the town with her simply because they didn't like her family. Catherine lived in a very small town in New South Wales, Australia, where basically everybody knew each other's business. But despite the abuse, Catherine always tried to focus on the future. She would tell herself that as much as my life is miserable right now, in the future I will have a family of my own and I will take care of them the way I wish my family had taken care of me. But when Catherine became a young woman and began dating men, all of her relationships would always crash and burn because inevitably she and her partner would become toxic and abusive and it would end the relationship. It was like Catherine both didn't know how to be a quality partner and didn't know how to identify a quality partner, likely because she didn't know what that looked like. She had been raised in this horrible household. But in 1995, when Catherine was 40 and really starting to feel desperate for someone to actually love and to love her back, she would meet a man named John Price, who was also 40, and he just seemed fundamentally different than every other man she had ever dated. He was empathetic to her troubled past, and he seemed to really care for her and really wanted to kind of take her under his wing and love her. And so immediately Catherine just fell head over heels in love with John, and in return it seemed very much like John had fallen head over heels in love with Catherine. That year, Catherine moved into John's house where he lived with his 3 young daughters, who right away took a liking to her. And so for the first time, Catherine felt like her life was really going the way she wanted it to go. But unfortunately, this would not last. Despite the seemingly perfect start to Catherine and John's relationship, it eventually began to sour when Catherine began to ask John if they were ever going to get married. Catherine really wanted to get married. She wanted to kind of officially have a family of her own that she could take care of, but John was weary of marriage because he had just left a failed marriage, and he told Catherine that realistically, he might never want to get married again. And so over time, this issue really drove the two apart, and it all came to a head in early February of 2000 when John and Catherine were at his house. They were in the kitchen, and they got into a heated fight over marriage, and then before long, they were both getting physical with each other, and during this altercation, Catherine kind of scrambled and grabbed a knife on the counter and actually slashed John across the chest. And as soon as she did this, the fight came to an end. John screamed at her to leave the apartment and never come back, but Catherine was already storming out of the apartment. They both understood that a line had been crossed, and almost certainly their relationship was now over. But over the following days and weeks, Catherine, who had moved into a different apartment at this time, kind of near where John was living, she felt very lonely, and even though she knew her relationship with John was not a healthy one, she longed to patch things up with him. She didn't like being alone. She wanted to have that family. And so she decided she would do what she had previously done in other relationships to kind of patch up the relationship after a fight. And so the way she would do this is she would kind of make sure they had the house to themselves, and then she would show up in lingerie and they would have kind of an intimate makeup moment, and then everything would go back to normal. So on February 29th, Catherine waited until she knew John had left for work, and she went over to his place, and she had a key to it still, and she went inside, and his 3 daughters were there. And so Catherine said hello, and she chatted with the kids for a minute, and then she made arrangements for the 3 kids to go get picked up by a babysitter and spend the night outside of the house. And so then when the babysitter came by the house and picked up the 3 girls, Catherine said goodbye to them, and then Catherine left John's place, and she went out to get her lingerie. Later in the evening, when John came back to his house, he went inside, and he found his kids weren't there, but there was a note from Catherine that explained where his kids were and how she wanted to make up with him, and she would be back in a little while. Now, John was not happy about this. He was angry that she had decided to just come into his house without asking him. That felt very violating. And then also she made a decision about his kids without talking to him. That just felt so offensive and wrong of her to do. And so John grabs a beer out of the fridge, he sits down in the living room, and he begins to wait for Catherine to show up. The next morning at 6 a.m., John was supposed to be at work already, but he wasn't. And so his company, who knew he was very reliable, were concerned something was wrong. And so they sent a worker to his property to see what was going on. And so the worker, he pulls up in front of John's house. John's car is in the driveway. And so the worker's first thought is, oh, I guess John must have overslept. And so the worker walks up onto John's front porch and he knocks on John's front door, but there's no answer. And so the worker knocks again, still no answer. And so this guy turns around to leave and go back and tell the company, look, I don't know what's going on. But as he's turning around, he notices on the very bottom of the outside of the door, kind of near the edge, the front edge of this door, there looked to be some blood on the outside of the door. It was pretty easy to tell it was blood. And so the worker was immediately very concerned, and he knocked again on the door, but no answer. And so he ran around to the side of the building and he began banging on the windows of John's house to hopefully rouse whoever was in there to come out and to make sure things were okay, but there was silence. And so the worker ran back to his car, he drove back to his office, and after he told his boss what he had found, they decided they had to call the police. The police would show up at John's residence at 8 a.m., and when they got there, John's vehicle was still in the driveway, the house was quiet and dark, and so the police, they walked up to the front door, they knocked on the door, there's no answer, it's silence, and so they walk around to the back of the property to try the back door, and as they're walking into the backyard, they see in the middle of the grass, right behind a window that led into the house, there was this plate of food that had been clearly thrown out of the house and landed face down on the grass. And so the police see that, they're thinking that's pretty weird. And so what they do first, before even going to the back door, is they turn to the window, which clearly the food had been thrown out of, but whoever had done it had then shut the window. And so they go over to the glass and press their faces up against it and peer inside. And there's no John, there's no people, there's nothing inside, it's dark. But right inside of this window is this big dining room table, and it's covered with this amazing spread of food. It looks like a Thanksgiving Day meal had been prepared, but then no one had eaten from it. And so they're thinking, okay, well, for whatever reason, one of these plates of food was thrown out the window. That's very odd. And so the police come off the window, they walk over to the back door, they knock a few more times, but after even more silence, they kick the back door down and they go inside. As soon as they step in, there's 2 officers. They walk straight into the house with the dining room table with all that food on their left, and there's nothing that stands out. They're calling for John. It's silent. Everything is off. Everything is quiet. And they keep on walking into what appears to be the living room where the TV is and where there's a couch. And as soon as they walk in, they see there's blood everywhere. And towards the front of the living room, where the front door actually opened into the house, there was a very obvious pool of blood. Basically, if you stepped into the house, you'd be stepping into this puddle of blood. And as they're looking at this pool of blood, they see there is a distinct blood trail from the pool back into the living room that they have just walked into, and the trail kind of leads behind a couch out of their view. And so they walk around the couch to see what's at the end of this trail, and they find Catherine Knight's crumpled body on the ground. And so right away they rush over to her and they feel for a pulse, and they discover that she actually does have a pulse, but very obviously she's clinging to life, barely. And so one of the officers stays with Catherine while they're calling in paramedics to come in and deal with her, while the other officer draws their weapon and they begin searching the rest of the house. And so the officer walks past the front door on their left, and they go into the other side of the first floor, which is basically like this lounge room, kind of like a secondary living room. And as they're looking out across this room, they see there's no one in it, but there appears to be this curtain blocking the entrance to some other side room. And this officer, as they're looking at it, they look down and they notice there's another blood trail that starts from the front of the house. It snakes all the way across this lounge room and kind of disappears into this covered up room. And so this officer yells out for John, but there's no answer. And so he ends up going all the way across, checking as he's going, looking around, but there's no one there. And he gets to this towel, and with his non-shooting hand, he kind of pushes it out of the way, and he looks inside of this space. And it turns out to just be a small closet. There was nothing of note inside. It didn't really make sense that the blood trail had led to this closet. But then, as the officer is kind of wondering why the blood trail ended here, he started to feel something cold on his non-shooting arm. And so he looked down at his arm, and he saw there was this huge streak of blood on his arm. And he knew he had not been wounded in some way. This was not his blood. So how did he get blood all over him? And then he stepped back in horror because he realized the curtain that he had just moved with the arm that had blood on it was not a curtain. The night before, John sat in his living room waiting for Catherine to return, very angrily waiting for her to come back. But by 11 p.m., she hadn't. And John, he works super early in the morning. He's very tired. He decides to just go to bed. And so he climbs into bed. He falls asleep. And then about an hour or so later, Catherine would walk into the bedroom. She had her black lingerie on that she had bought earlier in the day. And even though John was furious with her and very upset with what she had done that day, seeing her like this suddenly made him think, you know what, all my issues with her can wait. And before long, they were getting intimate together in the bed, and then they fell asleep in each other's arms. Later in the night, Catherine would wake up. John's still fast asleep, so she's looking right at him, and she suddenly has this intense sense of disgust. She was convinced that he was taking advantage of her, that the reason he didn't want to marry her was he was just kind of using her. And this anger inside of her boiled up, and she decided right then and there that I need to teach this man a lesson he will never forget. And so Catherine very quietly slipped out of the bed. John's still sleeping. She snuck out of the bedroom. She made her way out of the house, and she got into her car, and she drove across town to the apartment she had been staying in for the past couple of weeks, and she grabbed her work tools. Catherine, where she worked full-time, was a meat processing factory, and she worked on the kill floor with the animals that are being turned into meat. And so her skill set was butchering, and her tools were butcher's knives. And so she grabs her kit of butcher's knives, and she drives back to John's place. She goes into the house, she makes her way into the kitchen, and she unrolls this kit full of different sized butcher knives, and she picks the one she wants, she pulls it out, she makes sure it's nice and sharp, and then she made her way into John's bedroom. When she got into his bedroom, John was still asleep. He was lying on his back, covers up over him, fast asleep, and she climbed onto the bed, being very careful not to wake him. And then when she was straddling him kind of on her knees right over his midsection, she raised the knife up between her two hands, and she brought it down into his chest. John immediately shot up, bucking Catherine off of him. She went flying onto the floor, and then instinctively, John just begins running out of his bedroom. He has no idea what's happening. He's been stabbed, but he probably can't even feel it. It's all adrenaline. He is just running through the house. But by the time he gets to the front of the house, the blood loss had caused him to be so weak he could barely stand. And so he managed to open the front door, but then he collapsed onto the ground halfway between the inside and outside of the house. And so laying there, he reached out with his bloody hand, and he grabbed the edge of the door that was partially open and tried to pull himself out of the house. And that's how that bloody print was left on the outside of the door that the worker saw. And as he's trying to pull himself out of the house, Catherine, who had gotten up after being knocked off the bed, she ran to the front of the house, and she grabbed his legs, and she pulled him back into the house and then shut the door. And then once he was inside, she got on top of him and stabbed him an additional 36 times all over his body. And then she left him there to bleed to death. And so while he's dying, she goes into the kitchen and she puts on a large pot of water to boil. And then she began setting the plates all around the dining room table for a big family meal. After she was done setting the table, she went back over to John, who was now deceased at this point, and she dragged him all the way across that lounge room on the other side of the house that the officer walked through and then found that curtain. She dragged him all the way across that room to right in front of that closet. closet, and then using her expert skills from working in the meat factory, she proceeded to skin John from his neck all the way down to his toe. And she was so good at it that she was able to skin him in one piece. And she took this skin suit and she draped it over the entrance to this closet. And then she removed John's head from the now skinned torso, and she placed it in the water that she had put on to boil earlier. She was going to use his head to turn it into some sort of broth or gravy. And then she grabbed his skinned torso and dragged it into the kitchen and began butchering it and then making different dishes with his meat, different pies and casseroles. And then after she had made this enormous feast out of John's body, she set the food all around the table that she had already laid out, and then she made little placards, little name cards that had the names of each of John's children on them, and she placed them in front of each of the plates because her intention was to feed them their father. And then Catherine sat down at a plate that she had made for herself, and she began eating John, except it made her sick, and so she opened the window behind her and she threw her plate of food out into the backyard. And then when she turned back around and looked at what she had done, she decided that instead of facing the consequences, she would just take her own life. And so she went into the bathroom, she grabbed some sleeping pills, and then she cut across the front of the house, walking through that pool of blood near the door. She made her way into the living room, she overdosed on sleeping pills, and collapsed on the ground. However, when the paramedics finally showed up the following morning, they were able to save her. And so once she stabilized in the hospital, she was promptly arrested for John's murder. She would ultimately be found guilty. However, she would never take any responsibility. And then during her sentencing phase, she was given life in prison, but the judge made a special clause just for her. He told them that her file needed to be stamped, literally stamped, never to be released. Basically, there was no hope ever of her getting out of prison. And so after she was taken away, she would become the first woman in Australian history to be sentenced to life in prison without the possibility of parole. She's still alive today. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please offer to spray the like button's face with sunscreen, but instead use bear spray. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 1 or 2 video uploads. We now have a podcast that puts out weekly brand new content that you can only get on the podcast. It's called the MrBallen Podcast, Strange, Dark, and Mysterious Stories, and it's available on Spotify, iTunes, Apple, Amazon, basically anywhere you get a podcast, that's where you'll find it. If you want to get in touch with me, please follow me and then message me on any major social media platform. My username for all of them is MrBallen, and I really do read the bulk of my direct messages. We also have a second YouTube channel just called MrBallen Shorts, where we post random short videos and lost episodes. We also have a Facebook page that puts out near daily content. It's just called MrBallen. We also have a Snapchat channel that puts out episodes on Sundays. We have some very cool merch. Go over to shopmrballen.com to have a look. If you have a story suggestion, please drop it in our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, Facebook, Snapchat, podcasts, wherever, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Every year, hundreds of people go missing under baffling conditions in the woods of North America. I'm talking about people that are right in front of someone and then in an instant they're just gone and they're never found again. Or in some cases they are found again, but they're in places that are impossible to access. One former police detective named David Politis has investigated thousands of these strange disappearances, and he documents what he finds in his incredible book series called Missing 411. Today, we're going to look at 3 of his strangest Missing 411 cases. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please give the like button VIP access to the King to Ka roller coaster at Six Flags Great Adventure, New Jersey. And once the like button gets to the top of the ride, go ahead and manually turn off the ride and then close the park. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. On May 21st, 1941, Betty Albright and her 3-year-old son, Eldridge, traveled to her mother's house in rural Woodstock, Maryland. Betty had asked her mother if she would look after her son for the afternoon so Betty could catch up on some much-needed sleep. They arrived at Betty's mother's house at about 1:30, and right away Betty went inside, handed her son to her mom, and went upstairs to take a nap. As for Eldridge and his grandmother, they went out in the backyard to play. Now, Eldridge loved going to his granny's house because she had this enormous backyard for him to play in. If you were standing on her back porch looking out, it would be 250 meters of just open grass for him to run around in, and it butted up against this huge forest. And in the middle of her property, looking straight out at the forest, there was this 3-meter gap in the trees that if you walked through it, it would bring you down to this creek bed that was seasonal, and there was very rarely any water running through it. From the porch, anyone that was standing in this creek bed, you could clearly see. And so Eldridge was allowed to play in the creek bed, so long as he didn't go right or left in the creek, which would put him out of view from anybody on the porch. And so this particular day, when Eldridge and his grandmother went outside, Eldridge wanted to go play in the creek bed. So he immediately starts running across the yard towards it, along with his grandmother's 3 dogs. As for his grandmother, she just didn't have it in her to go all the way down to the creek bed, so she decided she would just sit on the porch and read a book and keep her eye on Eldridge. She remembers watching her grandson go all the way across the yard, get to the break in the trees, and then step down into the creek bed where he began goofing around with the dogs and throwing rocks and having a good time, clearly in view. And for the next 5-10 minutes, she just stared directly at her grandson and the dogs. And at some point, she picked up the book next to her and she began reading the book and then periodically looking up to check on her grandson and then back down to the book. At about 2 p.m., she was looking down at her book when she heard her grandson yell out for help. Now, 3-year-olds yell out for help all the time. Sometimes it's a big deal, and sometimes it's not such a big deal. But oftentimes, the sound of their voice gives away how serious it is. No matter what they say, it's like their tone gives away, should I take this seriously, or is this just a kid being a 3-year-old? And she would say that the way he was yelling sounded like a real emergency. When she poked her head up, even though she had seen him, less than a minute ago playing in the gap in the trees, now she's looking and he and the dogs are gone. And so of course she's alarmed. She hops out of her seat, she goes down the steps, and she starts walking across the yard towards Eldridge. And she's yelling his name and she's walking quickly. When she got about halfway across the yard, she heard Eldridge yell out again, except this time his voice was coming from way off in the forest, way farther away from the last time he had yelled out. It gave the impression to her that he had moved a great distance from the last time he yelled to her, and it triggered something inside of her that was telling her something is terribly wrong. And she began running towards the creek bed. Still no sign of the dogs. She can't see anything. She's just running towards the creek bed. When she gets about 10 meters away from the break in the trees, she hears her grandson yell out for a 3rd time, barely audible, way off in the forest. He yells out for help, and as he's yelling, it sounds like someone has stifled him and covered his mouth mid-yell. So she runs through the break in the trees down to the creek bed where she stops, and she looks out in front of her, and it's just dense forest, and there's no Eldridge, there's no dogs, there's nothing. She looks to her right down the creek bed, and there's nothing down there, and then she looks to her left, and one of her dogs is in the creek bed, maybe 10 meters away, facing away from her, and the dog is positioned in such a way that it's clearly looking at something. And so she runs down to the dog, thinking she's going to see maybe Eldridge or the other dogs, but there's nothing beyond the dog. The dog is just rooted to the spot. Its hair is raised, it's growling, and it's taking little steps back, like it's been spooked at whatever it's seen or whatever it's looking at. And she just looked up and tried to look in the direction the dog was looking, but there was nothing. It was just forest. And so at this point, she felt certain that someone must have abducted Eldridge. And so she turns, she tries to pull the dog to come with her, but the dog's not budging. And so she runs back to the house to wake up Eldridge's mother. The two of them come back down to the creek bed. The dog is still in the same position, growling and staring in the same direction, as if whatever it's looking at hasn't gone anywhere. And they look for a couple more minutes. They're yelling for Eldridge, and the grandmother is telling her daughter, look, I think he's been abducted. We gotta call the authorities. And finally she relents, and so they do manage to get the dog. They run back to the house and they call the police. Shortly thereafter, the state police showed up with this huge contingent of searchers, and they immediately went down to the creek bed, where they started pushing predominantly to the left side, which is where the dog was angled, and it was also where the grandmother had heard her grandson yelling from. And very quickly, police discover some of Eldridge's footprints about 50 meters down on the left side of the creek bed. They were in some sand right at the edge, and they were walking away as if he was leaving the area he had been told to stay in, which was in that gap in the trees. But interestingly, the footprints, it looked like he had been walking for maybe 20 or 30 meters when inexplicably the prints just stop, as if he stopped in the sand where he was. But had he gone right, left, straight, turned around, had he gone in any direction, there would have been additional prints in the sand, but there wasn't, which gave the impression that was where someone must have lifted him up and kidnapped him. But they never found any prints connected to a kidnapper. For the rest of the day and that night, they would not find any more signs of Eldridge or the other two missing dogs. The next day, about 24 hours after Eldridge had gone missing, there were a number of search crews that had gone well outside of the primary search area in hopes of maybe finding one of the two lost dogs, because they thought maybe they could bring them to the lost child. And this one crew that was 4 miles away from where Eldridge had gone missing, they were walking past a swamp when one of them heard what sounded like a child whimpering, and it was coming from inside the swamp. And so immediately they turn and start walking into the swamp, which had fairly deep water, and they get to this clearing and they see there's this rocky overhang with high grass all around it, kind of forming like a cave. And they hear this whimpering again, and it's coming from underneath that rock. And they rush over and they're pulling the grass aside, and sure enough, tucked underneath this rock, inside of this kind of makeshift cave, is Eldridge. He was laying on this really well-constructed bed of leaves that looked like an animal's den. So either Eldridge had found an animal's den, or he had built himself this beautiful bed of leaves. When they approached him, he was sleeping underneath this rock, and so that whimpering sound he was making, he must have been making in his sleep. And so as they got closer to him, he woke up and he kind of sat up, and he's very groggy and confused. You know, all of his clothes were really badly torn up, and he wasn't wearing any shoes, but he overall seemed okay. He just was very confused seeming. And so they scooped him up and they brought him back to search headquarters, reunited him with his mother and his grandmother, and everyone's just so relieved that he's alive. But at the same time, people were like, how did he get 4 miles away in the middle of a swamp? And so after the doctor cleared him, saying he was okay, besides some scratches and bruises, the police, along with the mother and the grandmother, sat down with Eldridge and asked him, what happened? But unfortunately, Eldridge appeared to not know this had even happened. He didn't even know he had spent 24 hours out in the middle of the woods by himself. It was like he had blacked the whole thing out. Because Eldridge was found alive and unharmed, the police did not continue to investigate this case. And so we don't know what caused him to suddenly be yelling for help and appear to be drifting farther and farther into the woods. We don't know what the dog saw in the creek that scared it so badly. We don't know how Eldridge moved 4 miles through a dense forest over multiple swamps, only to wind up in yet another swamp inside of a cave. Although the police came out and said Eldridge must have just wandered off on his own, basically everybody involved in this case believes someone or something abducted him. It's just very fortunate he was found alive. Unfortunately, there's no clarification about what happened to the other two dogs, although the way it's worded in the story, it does sound like they were never found. In the 1950s, the Thorpe family lived in Dunbar, Pennsylvania, which was a small town of less than 1,000 people. Their house was on a very quiet street with very few neighbors anywhere near them, and their property was right up against this forest that was right in their backyard. Their daughter, 2-year-old Anna, loved to play in their backyard, but she was instructed to stay on the grass section of their backyard and not venture into the forest because the forest was snake infested. And Anna was terrified of snakes, and so she happily obliged. On May 5th, 1950, Anna was playing in her backyard in that grassy section, and her mother was in the kitchen looking out the back window into the backyard, and her mother looked down for a second when she heard her daughter scream. She looked up and Anna was gone. She immediately ran outside and she's yelling for her daughter. She's looking all around and she knows she must have gone into the forest, and she's thinking to herself, she must have been bit by a snake and she's laying on the ground somewhere. That's why I can't see her. And so she runs into the forest and she's screaming for her daughter and she's not getting any response. She's starting to panic. All her yelling has gotten the attention of her 2 older sons that were in the house, They come running outside and they join the search and they start fanning out and they're looking for Anna, and she's just gone. And so after only a few minutes of looking, Anna's mother decides she has to call the police. The police show up and they launch this massive search, and word got out to the residents of Dunbar that one of their own had gone missing, a child no less. And so virtually everyone in Dunbar showed up to be a part of the search, and they combed that whole forest behind their property, and there was just no sign of Anna. After the first 24 hours had gone by and they had not found any sign of Anna, they decided to expand the search area from a 1-mile radius to a 3-mile radius. And within just hours of this change, there was a crew that was 3 miles away from where Anna had gone missing, and they found Anna, and she was alive. She was laying under this blackberry bush. All she had on was a single shoe. Next to her was a pile of clothes. When they went up to her, she seemed okay. They picked her up and they brought her back to the search headquarters where they reunited her with her parents. A doctor looked at her and the doctor said, there's no signs that she was attacked. There's really no signs of any wear and tear on her at all. It doesn't even look like she was outside for the past 24 hours. When Anna was asked about what happened to her, she wasn't able to give any sort of meaningful answer because she's only 2 years old. But the reason this case is included in today's video is not because, she vanished mysteriously in the forest and that she was actually found 3 miles away versus 1, or, that she was found with just a shoe on. The reason it's included in today's video is because for her to have been found where she was found, the only way for her to have arrived at that spot was if she crossed 10 barbed wire fences. There was no other way for her to have gotten there. The only other way would have been a massive detour that she literally could not have covered. An adult probably couldn't have covered in the amount of time given. So this 2-year-old with no scratches on her body is found on the other side of 10 barbed wire fences. I mean, even if you take the barbed wire off of the fence, a 2-year-old climbing a large fence, that alone is kind of a Herculean task. And to do it without scratching your body, it's not possible. It's truly impossible. A May 7th article in the LA Times said the police were baffled by this 10 fence dilemma, and they said the only way it would make sense is if she had been abducted and dumped there. But the police also repeatedly said there was no evidence to suggest she had been abducted or attacked or harmed in any way. It was just where she was found did not add up. Ultimately, the police came out with a statement saying this had to have been an accident, that Anna, the 2-year-old, managed to just somehow walk her way past all these fences and was found where she was, and thank goodness she's alive. But interestingly, the police confiscated her clothing and would not give that back to the parents, indicating there was further investigation happening even though the child had been found. But unfortunately, the police never revealed whether or not they actually discovered anything else about this case. And like in the Eldridge case, Anna's parents did not press for more information about what happened to their daughter because she was found alive and unharmed. Now, Anna's case might seem like some crazy anomaly, and that's all it is. But this is not the first time something like this has happened in this small area in Pennsylvania. 2 years earlier, and less than 10 miles away from where Anna went missing, another 2-year-old, Ronald Collier, also went missing in the same stretch of woods. His mother had been sitting with him on their back porch, which overlooked the same forest, and at some point his mother had gone inside, leaving Ronald sitting on one of the seats. When she came back out again, Ronald was gone. His mother estimated that she was inside for maybe 10 or 15 seconds tops. The police and the community came out in force and they combed through the woods and they could not find any sign of Ronald. And the police got really frustrated with Ronald's parents because they felt like this is impossible. How could this child not turn up considering the timeline you've given us, which is you went inside for 10, 15 seconds and your son is now completely gone. He's completely vanished. Like, you must have something to do with this. And so the police made Ronald's parents take polygraph tests, and his parents passed all of them. The search for Ronald continued for several weeks, but unfortunately, it was ultimately terminated and they never found him. People in the area believed someone or something, maybe a bear or some other animal, was lurking in the tree line and watching Ronald. And as soon as his mother went in the house, they ran up and snatched the child and ran away with him. However, the police came out and said there was no evidence to back up that this child had been kidnapped, that what's far more likely is Ronald just got up and walked away and disappeared. However, 2 years later, when Anna's case happened, these similarities between her case and Ronald's case were just too much for locals to overlook. And so people began saying, it looks like Anna was abducted and placed where she was ultimately found inside of those woods. And so probably whoever or whatever took Anna is the same person or thing that took Ronald. But Anna was just lucky enough to survive. Although this mystery predator theory is just that, a theory, it does seem more likely than Ronald in 15 seconds getting up and running off into oblivion, never to be found again, and Anna scaling 10 barbed wire fences in a 24-hour period without a scratch on her body. Unfortunately though, we'll probably never know the truth. In September of 2004, 49-year-old Robert Springfield, along with his 2 teenage sons, left their home in Wyoming, bound for the Bighorn Mountains in Montana. They were planning to do some elk hunting on the Crow Reservation, which is the homeland of the Crow tribe, and Robert and his family were members of the Crow Reservation and therefore had the rights to hunt on that land. The specific spot the boys were going to be hunting was Black Canyon, a particularly steep and rugged area. But Robert was well equipped for this type of environment because he had previously served in the United States Marine Corps in their Special Operations Unit, which would have meant he would have received a very high level of outdoor survival training, which is perfect for living up in the mountains. Robert's sons had apparently learned a lot from him and were very competent outdoorsmen as well. They arrived at the reserve on September 19th and immediately headed out to do some bow and arrow hunting. Their plan was the 2 boys would break off from their father and head over to the edge of the canyon and attempt to drive elk down into the valley so their dad could take a shot at them. But late in the afternoon, the 2 teenage boys had not seen a single elk, and so it was getting to be time to head back to the prearranged meeting spot, and so they packed up their stuff and they headed there. The boys make it to the meeting area and their father, Robert, is not there. So they sit down and they begin to wait. And an hour goes by, 2 hours goes by, 3 hours goes by, still no sign of their dad. They can't get in touch with him. They have no cell phone service. And so they're thinking to themselves, okay, worst case scenario, he got turned around and he'll have to spend the night out in the cold. But he's got warm winter clothes on. He knows what he's doing. He'll be fine. And so as the sun was setting, the boys did finally leave to go tell authorities that their dad was, lost in Black Canyon somewhere. But it was just not registering for them that this could be life-threatening, that something really bad could have happened to their dad. He was just this Superman figure to them, and it just did not cross their mind. Authorities launch a search that night that includes the use of helicopters with thermal imagers doing low flyovers of the entirety of Black Canyon. Thermal imagers pick up a heat signature, and so anyone that is alive gives off a heat signature. And so at night, if you were flying overhead and you saw a person in the middle of a canyon where there's virtually nothing else around them, they would stand out like a bright light. But that night, the helicopters combed all over Black Canyon and they never saw Robert. However, authorities would say that, this guy, he's trained, former special operator, he probably went and found shelter. So he could be inside of a cave, or maybe he made himself a shelter with tree branches, and it's obscuring him from the thermal imager, and so we'll just have to look tomorrow. But the next day, despite bringing out hundreds of searchers and bloodhounds and people on horseback and more helicopters and planes flying overhead, there was no sign of Robert. And after several weeks of still not finding any sign of Robert, they ultimately called it off. The family was obviously crushed, but more than that, they were just dumbfounded. The idea that something bad had happened to invincible Robert, that just didn't add up for them. And so after the official search was terminated, they would continue to make trips into Black Canyon looking for their father, their husband. But unfortunately, like all the searchers, they never found any trace of him and eventually accepted that he was gone. 1 year later, in October of 2005, a hunter who didn't know anything about Robert Springfield or the fact that he had disappeared, this hunter is in Black Canyon in the same area where Robert Springfield had disappeared. And this hunter is walking through this really dense forest. He's all alone. He's an experienced hunter, and he's not on a path. He's just kind of combing through the woods, and he starts to hear what sounds like a crow screeching. And at first, it doesn't really register with him. It's only in retrospect that he recalls this sequence of events. As he kept walking on, the screeching intensified to the point where he just could not ignore it. And so he stopped and turned to listen to this screeching crow that he couldn't see through the dense forest, but he could tell it was in that general direction. This hunter said as soon as he stopped and he turned and began actively listening to this crow, he had this weird sensation that the crow was trying to actively communicate with him. It was a very strange experience. He had never had anything like it in his entire hunting career, and he spent lots of time outdoors. And so he felt like he had to go over and see what was going on with this crow. And so he starts walking towards the crow. He still can't see it. It's very thick vegetation, and he's getting closer and closer, and he gets to a place where he can just barely see this crow. It's in a clearing. There is this large tree stump right in the middle of the clearing, and this tree stump is not short. It's like 6, 7, 8 feet high in the air. It looks like this tree had broken in the middle and fallen over, and this crow is sitting on the top of this kind of gnarled stump. And the crow is just incessantly screeching. And from this hunter's perspective, he can see the crow and he's kind of staring at it. And as the hunter is looking at this crow, the crow suddenly turns and looks directly at the hunter. And it recognizes the hunter can see the crow, and the crow stops screeching and is just staring directly at the hunter. And this hunter would say he felt so unsettled by the sudden behavior of the crow, because it was almost like confirming the crow was looking for him, and now he had found him, and he stopped screeching and was looking at him. The bird continued to stare silently at the hunter, to the point where the hunter felt compelled to walk out of the vegetation into the clearing to kind of confront the crow. And so he stepped into the clearing, and the crow the whole time is not screeching anymore, just looking at the hunter. And the hunter's standing in the clearing, and he looks at the crow, and the crow suddenly looks straight down. The hunter follows the crow's gaze down to the ground, and he sees at the base of the tree is a human skull. And the hunter's so taken aback by this, he looks back up at the crow, who's looking at him again. And the whole situation is so terrifying to this hunter that he just makes a note of where he is, and he runs. As soon as the hunter got out of the woods and was back in cell phone reception, he called authorities. Authorities showed up, and he showed them on the map where he had discovered this crow and the skull next to a tree. And sure enough, the authorities make their way out, and they find the skull right under this tree. The crow at this point is gone. When they walked up to the tree stump, they discovered it was not just a human skull, it was also a human femur bone right next to the skull. And then next to that was a set of boots that had been placed right next to them, neatly next to one another. And then next to that was a belt that had been tightly wound up and placed next to the boots. And then next to that was a jacket that was not folded, but was balled up, and inside of the jacket was a wallet containing cash and Robert Springfield's ID cards. The authorities launched a search in that area to look for the rest of Robert's remains, but unfortunately they were never recovered. Also, his bow and arrows were never found. The FBI was brought into the case because foul play was suspected, and they eventually determined that Robert must have been shot. And then they later recanted that statement and said actually he was hit by a falling tree. But if he was struck by a tree, then where is the rest of him? Wouldn't it have been in that area? And then why were all of his things neatly stacked? Certainly he wouldn't have done that after getting hit by a tree, so who neatly stacked his things after he was hit? And then also, where is his bow and arrows? But despite how improbable it sounds, that is the official theory, that he was hit by a falling tree. The family, along with many other people, believe he was attacked by someone or something up in those mountains. But if he had been attacked, his sons would have heard the struggle because they were in an area where sound carried really, really well. And if a person attacked him, why didn't they take the money out of his wallet? Also, where Robert's remains had been found was very close to where his original campsite had been with his two sons on the night he had gone missing. And so it was firmly located inside of the initial search grid, meaning had he been under a tree or been left for dead by some attacker in that area, he would have been found in those first couple of weeks that they were looking before the search was terminated. So the fact that he wasn't found means either hundreds of people didn't see him, including a helicopter with thermal imager, or he wasn't there until after the search was terminated. And if so, where was he? And perhaps the weirdest aspect of this entire case is the claim by this hunter that a crow apparently lured him over to this tree stump where he found Robert's remains. If you believe this hunter's story, and many, many people do, then do you really think it's a coincidence that all of this took place on Crow Reservation, home of the Crow tribe? I think not. But will we ever know the truth about what actually happened to Robert? I don't know. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please give the like button VIP access to the King to Ka roller coaster at Six Flags Great Adventure, New Jersey. And once they get to the top, manually turn off the ride and close the park. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Every year, hundreds of people go missing under baffling conditions in the woods of North America. I'm talking about people being right in front of their friends or their loved ones, and then in an instant, they're just gone, and they're never found again. Or they are found again, but they're found in places that are seemingly impossible to get to. One former police detective named David Paulides has written a book series called Missing 411, where he investigates these incredibly strange cases. Today, we're going to look at 3 Missing 411 cases that even amongst strange disappearances, these rank as particularly bizarre. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3, 4, even 5 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please replace the like button's 2021 calendar with a 2020 calendar that has a 1 glued over the 0. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. On June 16, 1946, 5 members of the Van Ulst family arrived at the Devil's Den State Park in western Arkansas to spend a week in a cabin they had rented. After getting unpacked, the father, along with his daughter, who was 8 years old, named Catherine, and her 2 older brothers, they headed down to the swimming area, which was this creek that led up to the side of a dam. Once they arrived at the creek, Catherine and her 2 brothers jumped in the water and started goofing around, and there were some other kids there they were playing with as well, and their father just sat on the edge to watch. Now, this swimming area had one really deep section that was right up against the dam wall that you were allowed to swim in, but the kids that were not strong swimmers tended to stay away from, and Catherine was not a great swimmer, and at one point she kind of drifted into the deep section, and her father didn't notice, and her 2 brothers didn't notice, but a woman who was staying at the campground, who the Van Ulst family didn't know, happened to be standing next to the edge of the water and saw Catherine struggling, and so she reached in and pulled her out, and Catherine was fine, and the woman told her, you gotta be more careful, you shouldn't be swimming in the deep end if you're not a strong swimmer, and Catherine said, okay. And so as they're talking, Catherine's father hears them and looks over and sees his daughter talking to some stranger. And so he makes a sound and waves in their direction to get this woman's attention, to be like, hey, what are you doing talking to my daughter? And the woman, she sees this, and she must have been a mother herself because she picked up on his uncomfortability. And so she turns to him and says, oh, no, everything is totally fine. I was just helping your daughter get out. Everything is totally fine. And so Catherine's father turns to his daughter and says, hey, you got to be more careful. Don't go in the deep end. And Catherine's like, okay. And instead of going back into the water, Catherine walks to the backside of the dam, because this dam, it was not a steep drop off on the outflow side. It was like a gradual slope of these big boulders that the kids at this campground would climb all over, and their parents would watch them from their positions next to the swimming area. And so Catherine's father was watching his 2 sons, and then he'd look over and watch Catherine, and back and forth, he kept his eye on all of his kids. But at some point when he was looking at his sons, he looked back at Catherine and she was gone. And so he stood up and he walked over thinking maybe she's gone all the way to the bottom and she's just out of sight because she's crouched down or something. But when he got to the edge and looked down, she wasn't down there. And so he's looking all around and he's thinking to himself, this is impossible. I just saw her on the rocks like seconds ago. Where could she have gone? And so he looks at his sons who are still in the swimming area and he says, hey, have you seen Catherine? And they're like, no, we haven't seen her. And then he turns to the woman that had previously pulled Catherine out of the water and he says, have you seen my daughter? And she said, no, the last I saw her, she was on the rocks. I don't know where she went. And so before long, Catherine's father is screaming for Catherine. He's enlisted the help of everybody at this campground that's in the vicinity to go look for his daughter. There are people jumping into the swimming area up top. There are people jumping into the swimming area on the backside of the dam. I mean, the whole area is getting searched and there's no sign of this girl. And after about an hour of looking, Catherine's father went and got police. After 2 days of searching the very very thick forest that surrounded this dam and finding no trace of Catherine, authorities decided it was far more likely she had drowned either above or below the dam than it was that she wandered off into the woods, considering where she was last seen. And so they shifted focus and began draining these two sections of water to see if her body would be at the bottom. But when they were drained, she wasn't there. And so once again, they went back to searching the forest. And so on June 22nd, 6 days after Catherine went missing, a group of searchers were located 7 miles way into the forest. They were walking up this mountain and they're yelling Catherine's name. And as they're walking, they stop when this little girl wearing only a bathing suit walks out of a cave, looks down at them and just says, "Here I am." The searchers couldn't believe it. It was Catherine. And besides some scratches on her arms and some bug bites, she seemed like she was perfectly fine. In fact, they would say she was eerily calm. It was like she was waking up from a dream. She was reunited with her family, who could not believe she was still alive. They brought her to the hospital and the doctors looked at her and said, yep, besides some superficial cuts and some bug bites, she's fine. And 2 days later, she was discharged. So this 8-year-old who's never spent any time in the woods before, this is her first exposure, her trip to Devil's Den State Park, survives on her own out in the wild for 6 days and 6 nights with only a bathing suit on. And despite there being no potable water anywhere near her where she was found up on that mountain, she was determined to be relatively well hydrated and had only lost a couple of pounds. Also, you need to understand the staggering distance she covered, because while she was found 7 miles away from where she went missing, that's as the crow flies. That's what you see on a map, those 7 miles. In the wild, you don't walk perfectly straight lines. There's too many obstructions, there's mountains, there's trees, there's all sorts of reasons that you end up zigging and zagging to wherever you're going. And so rescuers believe the minimum real distance she would have covered to get up to that cave was about 30 miles. And she did it barefoot. Catherine defied every search and rescue model for 8-year-olds that get lost in the wild. She was way outside the boundaries of what anybody would expect. Basically, she should have died. When authorities asked her, how did you do this? She said, I don't know. I don't remember how I got lost in the first place. I only remember sleeping on warm grass the first night. And then her next memory is waking up inside of a cave on day 6. She has no idea what happened between day 1 and day 6 when she traveled those 30 miles and somehow subsisted on some water source and some food source. While some say this is just a really weird case where she got very, very lucky, others think there was something in the forest that chased her and adrenaline kicked in, forcing her to run the 30 miles to that cave. And because it was so traumatic, she forgot the experience. But like virtually all of the missing 411 stories, we have a lot more questions than answers. On April 29th, 2001, 6-year-old Haley Zega was on a hike with her grandparents in a very rural part of Arkansas called the Upper Buffalo Wilderness Area. For an area to be deemed a wilderness area, that means no vehicles of any kind can come through there, making it incredibly remote and incredibly wild, hence the name. They had taken this trail that brought them up to the top of this bluff that was about 200 feet higher than where they started. And they got to this incredible overlook and they're looking down over this river. And at some point at about 11 in the morning, they turn around to head back. On the return trip by about 11:30, they're making their way down and Haley spots a waterfall that's off the side of the path. And she wants to go to it. She asks her grandparents, can we go check out this waterfall? And the grandparents kind of scope it out. And it seemed like the only way they could get down to view this waterfall would be by literally climbing a tree and descending over this cliff. And it was something that the grandparents just did not feel comfortable letting their granddaughter do. And so they told Haley, no, we need to keep going. We're not going to go check out that waterfall. And Haley, being a 6-year-old, she really wanted to see this waterfall and she wanted to get her way. And so she threw a tantrum and she sat down on the trail and she said, well, if you're not going to take me to the waterfall, I'm not going to move. You're going to have to carry me. And the grandparents were like, no, we're not going to carry you. You need to be a big girl. I need you to stand up and start walking with us. And Haley refused. And so her grandparents said, okay, we're going to leave you. And they turned around and they kept walking down the trail. Not far, and they were still totally in view, and it's broad daylight. And they would turn around expecting their granddaughter to stand up and kind of begrudgingly walk after them. And at some point she did. Haley stood up and she's like, okay, wait for me. And so she starts walking and the grandparents are like, all right. And so they're walking ahead of Haley. And as they're walking, Haley would just slow down more and more and more. And her grandparents could tell she was doing this. She was just trying to be frustrating and she was intentionally trying to take as long as she could. But the grandparents made sure they kept her in their view. So they would walk a little ways and turn and she'd be right there. They'd walk a little ways, they'd turn and she'd be right there over and over again. And then at some point when they turned, she wasn't there. And so the grandparents immediately run back up and they're looking around for Haley, thinking she probably darted behind a tree to hide because she wants, to be a little bit more frustrating for them. And so they're kind of looking for her. They're not that worried yet. They start yelling for her, saying, come on, we do got to leave. You got to come out. We got to go. But there was no word from Haley. It was just silence and she was just totally gone. And for the next 90 minutes, the grandparents just ran all up and down this trail screaming for Haley and they never found her. And so they ran down and they called police. The largest search and rescue mission in the history of Arkansas was launched for Haley Zega. It included hundreds of searchers on the ground, including 8 dog teams and helicopters overhead. There were firefighters, the National Guard was involved. But after 2 days, despite this incredible search, really no progress had been made. The only thing that had been found was one of the dog teams had tracked her scent up to a nearby road where the dog stopped, meaning the scent is now gone. And unfortunately, what that told investigators is it looks like Haley got picked up by some motorist. But 51 hours into the ordeal, there were 2 searchers well outside of the primary search area. They were about 2 miles away from where she'd gone missing. They spotted her. She was sitting next to this brook with her feet dangling in the water. And when she saw them, she kind of waved and they said, "Are you Haley Zega?" And she said, "Yeah." And she had a couple of scratches on her arm and on her face, but overall she seemed okay. And so Haley was reunited with her family and then she was brought to the hospital to be observed. After Haley had regained some of her strength, investigators asked her, what happened? And she said that she was walking behind her grandparents and that she looked down. And then when she looked up again, not only were her grandparents gone, but she was looking at this wall of trees. Like she was not on the trail anymore. She didn't know where she was. And since she was only 6 years old, she didn't stop and look around or yell. Instead, she just kept walking in this direction that she didn't recognize. And she walked and walked and walked and she never found the trail again. She said pretty soon it got dark and she slept on top of that bluff. And then the next day when the sun came up, she walked down the bluff and she made it to the river. And then she walked along the river until she found a cave where she slept for the second night. And then the next day when she got up, she was found. After she gave this explanation, investigators had a lot of questions. Like, if you were sleeping up on the bluff on that first night, then why couldn't the helicopter see you? Because that's all they were doing was flying over the bluff and they had thermal imaging. They could have very easily picked you up. And so they asked her, are you sure that's where you were? And she said, yeah, that's where Alicia told me to stay. And they were like, who's Alicia? And she said, oh, she's my imaginary friend. I met her on the bluff. And so immediately the investigators and the parents are like, okay, she's clearly coping with this traumatic event by creating this imaginary friend. And so they don't ask any more questions about the imaginary friend. Instead, they continue to ask questions about basically how she got from where she was lost to where she was found. And they say, okay, Haley, how did you get down the bluffs? Because there's only one way down and it can be hard to find, especially if you're off the trail. And Haley said, well, Alicia brought me to a trail and she led me down the bluffs. And she stood in front of me and made sure that I didn't fall forward. And so her parents and the investigators are now starting to think, maybe this isn't an imaginary friend if this person is right in front of her, kind of propping her up. And so they asked Haley, can you describe what Alicia looks like? And Haley said, sure. She has black hair, brown eyes. She's a little bit shorter than me. She's 4 years old. She likes to tell jokes and she likes to sing songs. And then Haley began singing songs that she had learned from Alicia and began telling jokes she had learned from Alicia. Even though Haley was giving this vivid description of this 4-year-old girl named Alicia running around the bluffs, it just couldn't be possible. And so Haley's parents and the investigators went back to treating Alicia as just an imaginary friend, just a simple coping mechanism. And so the investigators went back to just doing their interview with Haley. They got all the information about how she got from the bluffs down to the river as much as they could. And then because Haley was fine, they said, okay, you're good. See you later. Now, Haley's case was a really big deal and it was all over the news, especially after she was found. And so her interview where she said this imaginary friend named Alicia had assisted her in getting down the bluffs and had basically taken care of her, that was put in print. And after it was published, there were some readers that realized there was another little girl who had gone missing in the exact same spot as Haley 23 years earlier. She was 4 years old. She had black hair, brown eyes. Her name was Alana, and she had died on those bluffs. After this connection was made, it got national media attention because suddenly news outlets were saying this imaginary friend was actually Alana and that she was Haley's guardian angel. In fact, Haley was brought on Dateline to talk about her imaginary friend. This year, Haley, who's now 25 years old, posted a video to her YouTube channel where she tells her story of what happened over those 51 hours she was gone. And in the story, she talks about her imaginary friend. And she says, before Alicia, I never had an imaginary friend. And Afterwards, I never had an imaginary friend. But at the time, Alicia was very real to me, and I don't know who or what she was, but she saved my life. In September of 2012, 53-year-old Linda Ortega went to visit her brother, Eddie Huff, in St. Joe, Arkansas. St. Joe is a very rural part of Arkansas, and it's about a mile away from the Buffalo River National Park. The park is thickly forested and mountainous, and there's hundreds of small water bodies that are strewn throughout. On Saturday, September 22nd, Linda and Eddie decided to go for a walk in the park because Eddie apparently had heard of some great fishing spot, and he wanted to go find it. In searching for the spot, they stepped off of the trail and got turned around. Now they realized they got turned around, but it's broad daylight and they figured, okay, we'll find the trail soon. But as the sun was setting, they had still not found the trail and they realized they were badly lost. Then some very strange things happened that we only have a marginal understanding of. What we know is the brother and sister were together on that first day they went missing. We know they were together the following day on Sunday, still looking around for a way out of the park, but still at the end of the day were lost. Then the next day on Monday, we know the pair separated because Eddie re-emerged out of the park, hopped in his car like nothing was going on, drove back to his house, walked inside, and his family's like, where have you been? You've been missing. We've been calling you. Where have you been? And where's Linda? And he's like, oh, everything's fine. I dropped Linda off at a relative's house. She's fine too. And his family's looking at him like, do you not understand that you've been missing for like 3 days here? And he was just trying to tell them that everything was fine. But as they asked him more questions about specifically, what were you doing? Specifically, how did you get lost? Specifically, what time did you drop Linda off? Tell us all the details. As they did that, Eddie started to realize that, oh my goodness, I actually don't know what happened. And so his family called this relative that Eddie had claimed he dropped Linda off at. And when the relative picked up, they said, no, we don't have Linda here. I've not spoken to Eddie and I've not spoken to Linda. And so the family turns back to Eddie and they're like, where's Linda? And Eddie just said, I have no idea. And so the family contacts police and a search is launched for Linda. And they look all over this park for days and there's no sign of Linda. And people are starting to get really worried about her. And then on Thursday, so 3 days after Eddie had reemerged from the park and 5 days after they had originally gone missing, some searchers that were on ATVs were about 2 miles away from the entrance of the park in this very thick area. And they found Linda and she was alive. And initially, just like her brother Eddie, she really had no idea what was going on. She said she didn't understand how she got where she was and she was just really confused. And so they brought her back to the hospital and they put her under doctor's care and she ended up being fine. But as she's laying in the hospital, she starts kind of coming to and her memories start flooding back. And she tells the story of what happened to her and it's unbelievable. She said she and Eddie went into the park to find that fishing spot. And at some point they stepped off the trail thinking they were going to find it, but they didn't. They got turned around, they were lost, and they were confident they were going to find the trail and get out the same day, but they didn't. And so the sun went down and they were forced to sleep out in the wild. And so the next morning they get up and they continue to look around. They're yelling for help and there's no one around. They're in this very dense part of the forest. And all day, again, they're looking for this trail and they don't find it. And so that night, again, they sleep out in the wild. Linda said her memory, starting with the next day, which was Monday, started to get really foggy. She said she woke up and for some reason, she just got up and started running into the woods. She thinks it's because she thought Eddie was hurt and she was running to get help. And so it must have been around this time that Eddie, in his dazed state, got up and meandered his way successfully out of the park. Meanwhile, Linda said she was just running like a maniac into the middle of the woods, screaming for help from someone, even though she's in the middle of nowhere. And then miraculously, she says she saw a group of people way off in the distance. It looked like a group of hikers. And she started yelling for them and waving to them and trying to get their attention. And she said they all stopped and turned to look at her, but they didn't show any sign that they had actually heard her. They were not trying to interact with her. They were just looking at her. Linda said she thought that was pretty odd, but she just kept on running towards them and screaming and yelling and trying to get their attention. And she said when she got about 100 meters away from them, instead of them reciprocating waves or making a sound, they all ducked behind trees like they were trying to hide from Linda. Linda said this was the first time she felt really unsettled by what was happening, but she was desperate. She needed help. And so she just kept walking towards them. And she got to about 50 meters away when they all poked their heads out and looked out at her and then poked their heads back. Like they were not trying to interact with her. And Linda said she felt really scared and stopped. and began backpedaling away from this weird group of people that are hiding behind trees. And so while keeping her eyes on the general area where she knew they were hiding, she backpedaled all the way back to about 100 to maybe 150 meters away again, and this group came out from behind the trees and continued to stare at Linda. Linda said at this point she was terrified. She didn't know who or what those things were, but they were not there to help her. And then she said her memory got really foggy because all of a sudden her next memory is her laying on the ground in this pitch black forest. Her brother's not near her, and she's hearing footsteps, and she believes it's this group of people or things that are walking towards her, but it's so dark she can't see anything. And she said all night she heard the sounds of these people or things walking around the perimeter of where she was laying, totally exposed in the middle of the forest. Linda said her memories from this point until she was rescued are all mixed together, but she said she had one memory that really stood out to her because it was so terrifying. She said on one of the last mornings she was out there, she woke up, she was laying on the ground, she opens her eyes, and it was still dark, but the sun was starting to come up. And so there was enough light that she could begin to make out the layout of the forest. And so she sat up and immediately got the sense that she was being watched, but she didn't know by who or from where it was coming. She just had this intuitive sense that she was being watched. And as she's feeling this way, she hears movement coming off to her right, and she turns, and standing next to a tree about maybe 20 meters away is this dark silhouette of a man who's just staring at her. He's got no features. He's just this shadowy figure. And so she's horrified, and then she realizes there's another one, and she looks at that one and realizes there's another one and another one and another one. They're all around her. They're all around her looking in, these dark shadowy figures, and she's so scared. And as she's looking around at all of them, it seems like they registered that she sees them. And at that point, they all turned and start running into the forest in all different directions. She said after that, she has no idea the sequence of events or what happened. All she knows is that the whole time she was out there, she was scared. She felt like there were people watching her in the woods. And then at some point, rescuers showed up and she was saved. Linda's totally crazy account of what happened, combined with Eddie's bizarre behavior, totally baffled investigators. They really didn't know what to make of this. How did Eddie find his way out again? And why did he think Linda was at a relative's house? And who were the people Linda was seeing? And why can't either of them remember 90% of the experience? One theory is they must have eaten berries or some other food item that had hallucinogenic properties, and they were literally just hallucinating the whole time. However, if you follow along with David Paulides' missing 411 phenomenon, or if you watch some of the videos on this channel about the missing 411, then you know there are lots of other examples of people that go missing in the woods of North America that never ingest any food or any liquid, so there's no hallucinogen in their system, and they still have similar experiences to what Linda and Eddie did. So how do you explain that? So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you enjoyed today's video and you haven't done this already, please replace the Like Button's 2021 calendar with a 2020 calendar that has a 1 glued over the 0. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3, 4, even 5 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Fair warning, this story is going to be tough to listen to. It's a very sad story. But if this were to happen to me and my family, I would want people to know about it. So hopefully I can do it justice. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please convince the like button to sing karaoke and give them a Rammstein song, but do not put the lyrics on the screen. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. In 1996, 21-year-old Katie Fleming was studying French at the University of Oregon. That summer, she was invited to go on a camping trip with some very close friends and some people she had not met before. Their destination was this beautiful spot along the Sierra Nevada mountain range in California, but as soon as they got there, Katie did not take in any of the beautiful scenery. Instead, she fixated solely on 25-year-old James Kim, who was one of those people she had not met before that was going on this trip. And for the people that were on this trip, they would say James and Katie immediately just fell in love with each other. And for the duration of this trip, they were inseparable. And then when they got back from this trip, James would actually move from Seattle to Oregon to be with Katie. And then after Katie graduated from college, the two got married in Las Vegas and then settled in San Francisco. James, who loved technology and always had, was quickly hired by a tech company to try out new technology and then write a review for the average consumer. Basically, James got paid to play with toys, and so he loved his job. The couple also opened 2 boutique stores in San Francisco. One was an apothecary and the other sold eccentric clothing, and those 2 shops were managed by Katie full-time. By 2006, the Kim family had become very successful financially, and they had grown in size. They had a 4-year-old daughter named Penelope and a 7-month-old daughter named Sabine. Katie and James both adored their kids, but James especially was known for blowing off virtually everything and anyone to be with his daughters. In fact, his friends and family would say you couldn't even have a conversation with James if his daughters were in the room, because James would get distracted and just stare at his daughters and then would eventually just leave mid-conversation to go play with them. James was also known to bring his daughters to work virtually every chance he got, even if it really wasn't allowed at this company. On Friday, November 17th, James, Katie, and their 2 daughters loaded up into their station wagon and then drove north to Seattle. They planned on spending Thanksgiving with James's aunt and uncle who lived in the city. And also, James and Katie were considering leaving San Francisco and moving elsewhere, and Seattle seemed like a natural landing spot for them. So this trip served nicely as a chance to see family and to explore the area. And so late on Friday night, after a very long trip, they finally arrive in Seattle, and for the next couple of days, they have a wonderful time visiting with family and having Thanksgiving dinner. On Friday, November 24th, so a day after Thanksgiving, James, Katie, and their daughters loaded back up into the station wagon early in the morning. They said bye to James's aunt and uncle, and then they hit the road. But instead of just driving straight all the way to San Francisco, which would have taken the entire day and then some, they decided to make a stop in Portland, Oregon, where one of Katie's very close friends from college was going to meet them for lunch. And so after about 3.5, 4 hours, they arrive in Portland, they meet Katie's friend, and they have this nice lunch. And then afterwards, the family retired to a hotel where they crashed for the night. The next morning, the plan was originally to just get in the car and then drive all the way back to San Francisco. But Katie suggested to James that instead of just driving all day, why don't we just stay here for part of the day, leave in the afternoon, and we'll stop somewhere between here and home. We'll break up the drive one more time. James thought it was a great idea. They pulled out the map, and Katie found a nice family-friendly vacation spot that was almost exactly halfway between where they were and home. It was called the 22-Ton Lodge, and it was located on the coast of Oregon in a town called Gold Beach. And so James and Katie think, perfect, this is exactly what we needed. Katie calls the lodge, and she makes reservations for that night. And so that afternoon, after the family spent their nice day in Portland, they hopped in the car and they began traveling south towards the 22-Ton Lodge. At about 8:30 p.m., the family was still on the road making their way when James got really hungry and said, let's pull over and get a bite to eat. So the family pulls over at a Denny's restaurant in Central Oregon. They go inside, and then after a quick bite to eat, they get back out and they're on the road at 9 p.m. From the Denny's to the lodge was about a 2.5-hour drive. But after driving for 2 more hours, James realized they had missed a turn. So he told Katie about it, they looked at the map, and they realized if they were to backtrack all the way to that turn, it would add several more hours onto their trip. And so they began looking for an alternative path. And they found one. Instead of going all the way west to the coast and then all the way south to this lodge, which was the original plan, they could just go south from where they were all the way until they were parallel with this lodge. And then from there, they could just cut west along this road called Bear Camp Road that would basically go straight to their destination. But what this map did not do a good job of explaining was just how dangerous Bear Camp Road was. It started at 900 feet of elevation, but very quickly went all the way up to 4,000 feet feet of elevation before it went over the backside of this mountain down to Gold Beach and where this lodge was. While the road is paved, it's incredibly narrow and it's basically cut into a mountainside, and so there's very steep drop-offs throughout most of this ride, and there are no guardrails protecting people from falling off. The summer is really the only time people should be on Bear Camp Road because that's when the road is maintained. In the winter, the road is not plowed, it's not maintained, and so even a light snowstorm could make the road totally impassable. And the road cuts through a very remote section of Oregon where there's just not many people around. So if you get in trouble out there, you're probably on your own. But the Kims were not aware of the dangers this road possessed, and so after going south for a while, they did turn on to Bear Camp Road and began slowly driving up the mountain. And so as James is driving, Katie falls asleep in the passenger seat, the girls fall asleep in back, and outside it begins to snow. An hour later, Katie wakes up from her sleep, and the first thing she notices is outside, it is snowing so hard that James now has the windshield wipers on full blast, and still you could barely see out the front windshield. She looked at her husband, and he was hunched over, white-knuckling the steering wheel, looking intently out the window, and she says to him, what's going on? Should we stop? Should we turn around? And James, without even looking at her, says, yeah, honey, I do want to turn around, but the road is so narrow, we can't. And then he would tell his wife that earlier, they had actually driven through a fork in the road where there was enough space to turn around. And so now he was just hopeful that there'd be another fork somewhere that would allow them to turn around. And so Katie was not excited about the idea, but she trusted James and said, okay, let's keep going. And so James just continues driving up this mountain pass. And you got to understand, they are driving on basically a cliff. On the left side, left of James, is just a sheer drop-off, and the road is totally slick from the snow. And so periodically, as James is driving, even though he's only going about 5 miles an hour, he would begin to slip and slide, and he's right on the edge of this cliff. And so it was a very, very stressful ride, and after several more miles of this, they were not reaching any turnaround. In fact, they would have to periodically stop on inclines, put up the emergency brake, and one of them would have to get out and clear branches and rocks out of this tiny little road to continue onward. And so finally, Katie says to James, you gotta stop, you gotta back out of here. That's our only choice right now. And so James put the car in reverse and he opens his car door so he can look down at the edge of this cliff to make sure he doesn't accidentally veer off of it. And so very slowly, without even applying the gas, he began going in reverse, making sure he didn't go off the cliff. And for hours and hours they did this. This must have been so stressful. But finally, they make it to this fork in the road that James had seen much earlier, and they're able to make a decision. They had two paths they could take. They could turn around completely and drive nose out along the path they came in on all the way to the highway, but that was a very far drive and they knew that road was treacherous and there was a cliff drop off and it was really just as dangerous as what they had been on, and they really were not keen to be on that road considering the weather. Or they could turn left and go down the mountain on this path that was way wider than the paths they were on. It was like this huge road and it looked like it went straight to the bottom of the mountain. And they're thinking, we don't know where this goes. The signage is not clear where this goes, but you got to figure if you're going lower in elevation, the weather will not be as bad. And maybe if you go down this road, there'll be houses or there'll be a gas station or there'll be something. But whatever it is, it's probably better than going that way or that way. And so James turned the car and began driving down this new road. Unfortunately, this was the worst choice they could have made. This road they were now on was this long, winding dead end that was used by loggers in the summer. Now, normally, this mistake by the Kim family would have been caught because there was supposed to be a big yellow gate that sat across this road just a little ways past this fork, blocking all traffic from proceeding any further. But vandals had recently come up and cut the lock on this gate, swung it open, and then locked it open. So the gate is completely off the road. And so as the Kims drove past where they normally would have been stopped, they didn't even see a gate. There was no gate anywhere, and so they just kept on driving. And from where this gate should have been, the road went from paved to dirt and full of potholes, and it narrowed considerably. The couple drove for 15 miles on this very tight, winding road that once again was on a cliffside until finally they reached another fork in the road where they could either go right or they could go straight, but there was no sign telling them which way led to what. And so James stopped the car right in the middle of this intersection, and he and Katie look at each other and they know they're in trouble. So they get their phones out and they try calling for help, but they have no service. And so as they're struggling to place calls, one of them realizes it's no longer snowing. It's actually raining, and a lot of the snow on the ground seems to be getting washed away. And so after not being able to place calls for several minutes, they decide, you know what? It's 2 a.m. We're tired. Let's sleep here. We'll leave the car running. It'll be nice and warm. And when we wake up in the morning, this rain will most likely have washed away the snow and we can just drive out of here. And so the two are kind of relieved as they're saying this out loud that this situation is not nearly as bad as it seems. We'll be just fine. And so Katie, James, their 2 daughters, they fall asleep with the car running. It's nice and warm. And when they wake up, Katie and James realize it's gotten much, much worse. At some point in the night after they fell asleep, the temperature must have dropped again, and that rain became very heavy snow. And so all the water on the ground froze, and then almost a foot of snow fell on top of it. They were stuck. But Katie and James, they didn't panic because they remembered when they first turned onto Bear Camp Road, they had seen a plow truck parked off of the side of the road. And so to them, that meant if it snowed along Bear Camp Road, it would get plowed. And so that day, the Kims just stayed inside of their car and they ate snacks and they read books and they kept the heater on and they waited to be rescued. But over the course of that entire day, nobody came down that road. No plows, no anybody. And Katie and James continuously tried their cell phones to try to punch out and get some help, but they never had any service. Also, Katie and James continuously honked the horn in case someone was in the area that might hear them, but no one ever came to their rescue. And so by the end of that Sunday night, Katie and James were really starting to get worried because they have a 4-year-old and a 7-month-old. They cannot be out here for very much longer. But they began to tell each other that, you know what, it's Sunday. Maybe the plows don't come through on Sundays. Maybe they just don't work out here on Sundays. And so tomorrow, Monday, the plows will be out here. They'll come by and they will save us. Also, Katie and James began telling each other to reassure each other that, hey, tomorrow, Monday, that's the day we were supposed to be back in San Francisco. And so people are bound to notice our absence and they will report it to police and they will come out here and they will save us. So tomorrow we are going to get found. And so Katie and James, they put their 2 daughters in their car seats and James read them some bedtime stories and then the family fell asleep. The next day, Monday, the family did a lot of the same things they did the day before. They sat in their car, they kept spirits high, they tried to use their cell phones, which didn't work. They honked their horns to get people's attention. That didn't work. They tried to ration their food, and the whole time they're keeping their eyes up each side of this road they're on in hopes a plow comes through. But all day long, no trucks, no plows, nothing comes down this road. Meanwhile, back in San Francisco, the family's absence was noticed by a family friend, but they didn't report it to police because they figured the Kim family had just decided to stay out a little bit longer and they would be back soon. By Monday night, Katie and James were officially terrified. They were almost out of fuel in their car. They were almost out of food. In fact, to compensate for their low amount of food, Katie had begun not only breastfeeding her 7-month-old, but also began breastfeeding her 4-year-old. Also, outside of their car, bears began kind of assembling and checking them out. And at first, Katie and James would scream and yell and try to scare them off, but the bears ultimately were not that fazed by them. They were not aggressive, but it meant the family did not feel comfortable getting out of their car. And so they're in this very claustrophobic situation where they are literally trapped inside of this small car where all the windows are covered with snow and they can't go anywhere. They can't call anyone. They're running out of their supplies. I mean, this is a terrifying situation to be in. Katie and James had been really strong to this point, but around this time, they began to act scared and their kids picked up on it and they started acting scared and fearful. And so the parents were trying their best to calm them down and tell them everything's going to be fine and they're going to get out of here soon. But in reality, Katie and James knew that if they didn't get found soon, they were probably going to die. The next day when they woke up, which was Tuesday, again, no cars or trucks came down either road. There was no plows. The snow just continued to pile up and the food was running unbelievably low to the point where James actually left the car and went out looking for bear droppings because there's bears all over the place now. And he would pull the berries out of their droppings and he and Katie began eating those. But after a while, they decided that was not a good idea because they might poison themselves. Their daughters, who the day before had been acting acting out of fear and anxiety were now lethargic and quiet. And the parents' response to this was to start fighting with each other about whose fault this was, when in reality, they were just totally scared about what might happen to them. Meanwhile, back in San Francisco, the family had still not been reported to police. And so that night, Tuesday night, the Kim family once again huddled up inside of their car. James read the kids' books, and then they all fell asleep. The next morning, Wednesday, they ran out of gas for their car. And so they had no way to heat themselves. And so James got the spare tire out of the back of the car, and he rounded up some magazines inside of the car, and he lit a fire for the family to stand around and try to warm up by. And it worked, but the fire very quickly died out, and they couldn't find any wood that wasn't soaking wet to put on it. And so before long, they did not have a fire. And so all day that day, James and Katie were desperately looking up the road in hopes that a car or truck would come through. They never did. James and Katie tried their cell phones repeatedly, but they never got service. They honked their horns and they screamed out for help, but nobody heard them. And so before long, it was dark again, and the family was huddled up inside of their now freezing car, and all they could hear outside was the sounds of bears marching around the area. And so I'm sure James and Katie thought to themselves, I wonder if we'll survive the night. Meanwhile, back in San Francisco, that family friend who had noticed the Kims were gone on Monday, she did go to the police on Wednesday afternoon and reported them missing. And so a search party was being organized that night. But of course, the Kim family would have no way of knowing that. The next morning, Thursday, the Kim family woke up, they survived the night, but at this point, James and Katie are speaking openly about the real possibility that they all might die. In fact, Katie says to James, you have to promise me if our two kids die out here, you have to kill me too. And James said he would. At this point, Katie and James do not believe a truck or a car or anything is going to drive down this road and save them. They believe their only hope of being rescued is by sending a smoke signal up into the air that a pilot might see. So they pull off all four tires of their car, and then they pull everything out of the car that might burn, and they stack that on the tires, and that included Penelope's prized stuffed lamb. And then once they had their big pile, they lit it on fire, and fairly quickly, a large black billowing cloud of smoke was going straight up to the sky. And for a minute, the Kim family was very optimistic that they were about to be found, that certainly someone was going to see the smoke and come find them. But unfortunately, the fire burned out very quickly, they couldn't light it again, and nobody flew overhead. And so before long, the family is once again huddled inside of their freezing cold car that night. There's bears walking around outside. They're basically out of food. Their kids aren't even crying anymore. They're just silent and cold and miserable. And as they're all shivering and trying to stay warm, James realizes he needs to do something drastic or his family's going to die. And so the next morning, Friday, when they get up, James tells Katie that he had been studying the map and there is a town about 4 miles east called Galice that he believes he can get to in about 2 hours. Katie immediately said, no, you cannot leave us. We need you here. There's probably a search party out there looking for us right now. We need to stay together so we can all be found. But James's instincts were telling him that no one was coming for them, or no one was going to actually find them in time. And so their only hope was if he ventured off and found help. And so Katie finally reluctantly agrees to let him go because he seemed really confident. And so at 7:45 a.m. that morning, James gave his two daughters a big hug and a kiss, told them he loved them and he would see them soon. And then he hugged his wife and said he loved her. And then he turned around and walked up the road out of sight. At the same time, unbeknownst to the Kim family, hundreds of searchers and helicopters are all over Bear Camp Road looking for them. 2 days later, on Sunday, December 3rd, so a week after the family had originally gotten stuck, a helicopter pilot that was part of the search effort was flying around Bear Camp Road when he noticed footprints in the snow below. When he started following these footprints, and eventually the footprints kind of disappeared under some trees, and then he couldn't pick them up again. And so without that much fuel left, he decided he would just backtrack and follow the footprints back to their origin. And so he retraced these footprints for quite a while until he came to a clearing, and in the middle of the clearing was a car, and next to the car was Katie waving an umbrella back and forth. The pilot immediately knew who he was looking at, but he didn't have enough fuel to actually land and pick her and her family up. And so instead, he just hovered down as low as he could, and he made good eye contact with her to reassure her that I see you and we're coming for you. And then he marked on the map where they were. He flew off to the search headquarters, and just minutes later, another helicopter was spun up. They flew to that same location, and they were able to land in that clearing. And as soon as the pilot got out, he saw Katie running up to him, carrying her two daughters, who looked like they were in pretty good shape. And she's crying tears of joy, and she's thanking him profusely. And then when she's right up in front of him, she says, are you here because of my husband? Did James tell you where we were? And the pilot looked visibly confused. Katie picked up on it, and she explained how just 2 days earlier, James had left to go to the town of Galice to get help, and he still hadn't come back yet. And so at this point, the pilot understood what was happening, and so he looked down and he said, "No, ma'am, we still have not found James." Katie was devastated, and she cried as she and her daughters were loaded into the helicopter and airlifted out of the forest and brought to a hospital. There they would make full recoveries. Meanwhile, the search effort, which had been all over Bear Camp Road, was suddenly focused exclusively on the area around where their car was. And professional trackers were brought in to look for James's tracks, and they found them fairly quickly and began following them. James, after departing his family to go look for help, which must have been the most difficult decision he had ever made in his entire life. He loved his family more than anything, and he had to abandon them in the middle of the wilderness with no food, with no power, and he has no idea if he'll ever see them again. And so after leaving them behind, he walked 3 miles up the road they came in on, and then instead of just continuing on that road in the direction of Galice, he deviated and walked off the road. He actually went straight down one of the cliffs until he hit a river. And it's believed that maybe he saw the river from up on the road and thought that would be a faster way to get to Galice. But either way, he got down to the river, and as he walked, he would leave behind him little bits of torn clothing and torn paper to create a trail of where he was going, presumably so if he needed to, he could backtrack to his family. And so he gets down to this river, and for several miles he walks downstream. And then after being gone for at least 2 hours and not reaching the town of Galice, he must have realized he had either gone the wrong way, and that's why he had not hit the town, or he had miscalculated the distance, and that's why he had not hit the town. But either way, he did not turn around and go back to his family. Instead, he pressed on, believing he was their only hope. And so on he went, crossing over rivers, getting totally soaked in frigid water. He went up and down mountains all over these totally rugged areas in nothing but street clothes. He had sneakers, pants, and a jacket on. He had no food, he had no water, and he just kept on going until it was nightfall, and he had covered about 10 miles at this point, and he laid down and he went to sleep. And that night must have been absolutely horrible. As he thought about his family that was alone in the woods somewhere. He probably wondered if they were still alive. And the temperature was in the 30s, and again, he's just in street clothes. But he survives the night, and so the next morning, that Saturday, he gets up and he's right back at it, despite the fact that he was physically wrecked at this point. But for him, he didn't care. He was doing it for his family. And so all day he hiked in and out of freezing cold streams, up and down mountains, until finally he found himself at the bottom of this deep ravine next to a river where he just fell to his knees, fell forward, and died. He had literally just kept on going, looking for help for his family until he eventually succumbed to hypothermia. James's body was located 2 days after his wife and his daughters were successfully rescued. It would turn out the town of Galice was not 4 miles away from the family's car. It was about 15 miles away, but that's from point A to point B on a map, like a straight line. But when you actually are hiking in the wilderness, you don't go in straight lines because there's mountains and there's rivers and there's things that get in the way. And so in order to get to Galice from where their car was, James would have had to travel 30 or 40 miles, zigging and zagging up over 4 different mountains. And so this was a suicide mission from the start. James ultimately covered 16 miles through some of the most treacherous terrain in the country, wearing nothing but his street clothes. The professional trackers that followed this 16-mile trail to his body, they called his journey superhuman. The helicopter pilot would later say he never would have found Katie and the girls had he not spotted those footprints first and then traced them all the way back to that clearing. And it would turn out those footprints were made by James after he left his family and walked off to get help. And so even though it cost him his life, James did ultimately save his family. So that's going to do it, guys. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please convince the like button to sing karaoke and then give them a Rammstein song, but don't put the lyrics up on the screen. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. We are now selling merchandise like flannels and hats and a whole bunch of stuff. You can buy it at shopmrballen.com. Also, go follow our shop's Instagram page called Shop Mr. Ballen. There you can find deals and upcoming promotions. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. We also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where we upload random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called Mr. Ballen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. Sometimes the truth is stranger than fiction. And today we're going to look at 3 stories that demonstrate that. But before we get into today's stories, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you come to the right channel because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, the next time you're in a very crowded parking lot and you see the like button driving around looking for a spot, flag them down and point to your car suggesting you're going to leave, and then go to your car and stand there fumbling for your keys for a few minutes, and then just walk away. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's stories. In 1918, during World War I, British soldier Henry Tandy found himself stationed inside of a trench in northern France. By this point, Henry was already considered a war hero, and he would go on to become the most decorated British soldier in World War I. But his awards are not what he is remembered for. On September 28th of that year, after a long day of fighting, Henry was propped up on the edge of his trench looking out towards the German line. It was dark and quiet, and there was mist in the air, and at some point, Henry noticed a figure way off in the distance walking towards him. Henry instinctively raised his rifle, but he didn't pull the trigger. He wanted to make sure who he was shooting was his enemy, because it could be one of their own men who got wounded and was making his way back to the trench. And so Henry's looking down his gun, staring at the sky, waiting to figure out who he is, and after a few seconds, out of the mist walks a badly wounded German soldier, so it is his enemy, but he wasn't carrying a weapon, and he didn't appear to understand he was walking directly into Henry's sights. Henry aimed his rifle right at this German man's heart, but he didn't pull the trigger, and the man just continued to walk directly towards Henry until he got about 30 meters away, at which point he stopped and looked up and realized his mistake. But instead of trying to run away, he just stood there and stared at Henry, seeming to accept the fact that he was about to die. Now, Henry had shot many men during the war so far, but he just could not bring himself to shoot this unarmed, wounded German who just looked kind of pathetic. And so with Henry's gun still up, he glanced to his left and he glanced to his right to make sure nobody was watching. None of his comrades were going to see this. And then he lowered his gun. And then Henry and this German man just stared at each other for a while until the German man just nodded his thanks, turned around, and wandered back into the mist out of sight. The man Henry had just saved was Adolf Hitler. In the early morning hours of June 10th, 1994, Deborah Hoyt suddenly woke up in the middle of the night. She and her husband were staying with relatives in Sacramento, California, and they were supposed to be there for the next couple of days. But as she was sitting there, she had this overwhelming urge to want to leave right then and there and head back to their home in Lake Tahoe. Because she didn't really know what to make of this overwhelming feeling, she shook her husband awake and told him about it. She thought that maybe something was wrong, and he said, "You know what, you probably just had a bad dream and you're kind of waking up still half in your dream. It's not a big deal. Just go back to bed. I'm sure everything is totally fine. And in the morning, if you still want to, I'd be happy to leave." And so Deborah said, "Yeah, you're right. I'm totally overreacting. I'm sure it was just a dream." And she laid back down to try to go back to sleep. But as she laid there, that sense of dread that something was wrong and that she had to leave right now, it was just growing and growing and growing until she just jumped out of the bed and she's just standing in the room and she says to her husband, "Honey, we gotta go right now. I don't know what's wrong, but we gotta go right now." And her husband did not want to go. And he said, "Come on, Deborah, get back in bed. It's not a big deal." But she was adamant. She said, "Get out of bed. We're leaving right now." And so begrudgingly, her husband said, "Okay, we'll leave right now." And so the two of them hastily packed up and then went downstairs and left a note for their relatives explaining their absence. And then they got in their car and they drove off. After a little while, the couple reached a very dangerous section of their journey back home. It was called Bullion Bend, and it was a very windy road up in the mountains where one wrong turn and you're going flying down the side of a mountain. After driving through this area for about 15 minutes, they rounded a particularly sharp turn, and as soon as they made the turn and could look down the road, Deborah, who was in the passenger seat, she saw up ahead on the right, off the side of the road several feet, something that was just lying there on the side of the road. She didn't know what it was. She thought it was maybe a bag or some trash or maybe a dead animal. And at first she was just going to dismiss it. But as her husband drove closer and closer to it, the light began to illuminate it and she looked at it and couldn't really discern what it was until they were right next to it. And she looked out her window and she noticed it was a woman's body, a woman who had no clothes on, who was just lying there totally motionless. And Deborah immediately turns to her husband and says, "Honey, I just saw a dead woman on the side of the road." And her husband immediately is kind of panicked and doesn't slow down. He just keeps driving and says, "Hey, should we stop? Should we turn around? I mean, maybe she's not dead. Maybe we can help her." But Deborah at this point is now terrified and she's saying, "No, keep going. Don't go back. I bet it's a trap. Someone probably put her there and they're going to lure us in and they're going to attack us if we try to stop and help her." And so in this kind of chaotic, frenzied reaction that Deborah and her husband are having, they decide that their best course of action is just to drive on and find the next payphone and call the police. And it just so happened that less than a quarter of a mile away was a ranger station with a phone. And so they pull into the parking lot and Deborah calls the police. The police tell her to wait inside of her car and they'll be out in a couple of minutes and they're going to need her to bring them up to where she saw this body. So a couple of minutes goes by, the police show up, and they tell them to drive back up the road, but stop about 200 yards short of where you believe this woman's body is. And so Deborah and her husband, they get back in the car, they drive back up the road where they came from, and right at this point where the road turned very sharply is where Deborah knew on the other side of this turn would be this body. And so they pulled over on the side of the road, the police came up on their side, and they said, "Yep, right around the corner, you're going to find her lying on the ground on the left side." And so Deborah and her husband are just sitting in the car watching as the police go up, they make that turn, and they kind of disappear out of sight, and then they see their spotlight moving around on the other side of this turn, and so they figure, okay, they're looking for the body. But after several minutes, the police came back down the road, and they stopped next to Deborah's car, and they said, "You know what, guys? We didn't see anything up there. There wasn't a body. There wasn't anything out of the ordinary." And Deborah would say to police, "I'm not lying. I know what I saw. It was a woman's body right there in front of me. I know it. It's right over there." And they would tell her that, "We believe you, but we can't do anything because there's nothing up there." And so they told Deborah and her husband to just head home, and they did. After Deborah and her husband took off and were gone, the two responding officers drove back to their police station, and once they were inside, they began speculating about what Deborah might have seen. And as they were talking, another officer came into the station, a guy by the name of Rich Strasser, and he overhears them, and he goes over. He's intrigued, and he asked them, "What happened? What did you see?" And they explained to him that this woman, Deborah, had spotted a supposed dead woman's body up on Bullion Bend. And as soon as he heard Bullion Bend, Rich remembered that just a couple of days ago, they had received a missing person report of a young woman named Christine Skubish and her young son named Nick, who had gone missing, and the last place they had been seen was up on Bullion Bend. And so Rich wondered if maybe there was a body up there, and maybe it was Christine's. And so the next morning, Rich got up early and he headed out to Bullion Bend, and when he reached the exact spot where Deborah had claimed to have seen this dead woman's body, he found a children's shoe. And so he stopped his car, he got out, he picked the shoe up, and he's looking around and he's looking for anything else that's out of the ordinary, but there's nothing on the road, there's no skid marks, there's no other debris, there's no other clothes, there's nothing. And so he walks over to the guardrail that overlooks this very steep embankment, and he looks down the other side, and at first all he sees is just trees everywhere, but as he's looking, he thinks he sees more clothing farther down the mountain. And so he climbs over the guardrail and he very carefully maneuvers his way down, and after only a couple of seconds, he reaches a clearing in the branches and the trees, and he can see down to where the train kind of levels off, and right down there is a smashed up red 4-door sedan. It was the same type of car that Christine Skubish had been driving when she went missing. And so Rich ran down the mountain, following debris all the way to this wrecked car. He goes around to the driver's side and he looks inside, and there in the driver's seat is Christine Skubish, and unfortunately she was deceased. And then on the passenger seat is her son, Nicky, and he is alive, but barely. He had gone 5 days without food or water. And doctors would say when Rich found him, he probably only had about 1, maybe 2 hours before he would have died as well. Authorities believe Christine fell asleep at the wheel and she drove off that embankment. Initially, Rich believed Deborah must have seen Christine when she was driving through the mountains and saw that woman on the side of the road. After her accident, Christine must have gotten out of her car and then climbed up that embankment and then laid on the road, hoping someone would see her. And then when no one stopped for her, she went back down to her car where she ultimately died. But according to the coroner, that would have been impossible because when Christine crashed off the road, she died on impact 5 days before Deborah saw that woman on the side of the road. So it could not have been Christine. To this day, no one knows for sure who or what Deborah saw on the side of the road. But it is objectively true that Rich only investigated Bully and Bend and found Nicky alive because of Deborah's police report about this dead woman on the side of the road. And Deborah was only on that road because she'd had this totally weird middle of the night urge to suddenly leave a relative's house and drive up into the mountains, something she had never felt before and didn't really know how to explain. So either this is an extremely strange set of circumstances, or Nicky had a guardian angel. In early 1983, residents of the Cranley Gardens apartment complex in North London began complaining about their drains being clogged up. Initially, their landlord was dismissive and said, "Oh, it's just an old building, it's old plumbing, and that's why it's slow." But eventually, the landlord conceded and asked a plumber to come out and have a look. And so, on the evening of February 8th, an experienced plumber named Mike came out to Cranley Gardens, and after learning what the complaints were, he went around to the side of the building and he opened up a drain cover to have a look inside. As expected, when he shined his light down, he saw wads of hair and napkins and other things kind of mashed together, clogging up the pipes. And so he reached in and he began pulling this stuff out and putting it in a bucket right next to him. And then after he had cleared the majority of the obstruction, he reached his arm all the way into this pipe to feel around to see if there was anything in there that he just couldn't see. And at some point, as he was reaching, when his arm was almost completely into this pipe, his hand hit a major blockage. And so he moved his fingers around to try to feel what it was, but he couldn't tell. It was something that was fairly soft, but there were some hard things inside of it, like sticks or rods. So he grabbed a handful of this blockage and he pulled his arm back out of the pipe. He opened his hand, and what he was holding looked like ground meat, but it wasn't any meat he had ever seen before. And inside of this fleshy substance looked like little bits of bone. Now, Mike had cleared many pipes before, and he had never seen meat be the reason for a blockage. And so this whole situation just seemed really strange, and he decided, it's late, I'll just come back tomorrow with my supervisor so he can see what this is too. So Mike puts the cap back on the drain pipe, and he walks out from behind the building back out towards his truck parked on the road. And as he's walking, two of the residents of this complex come out and they say, "Hey, did you fix the blockage? What was it?" And Mike would say no, he hadn't. And then he just kind of blurted out that there was meat in the pipes. That was what was causing the blockage. And then one of these two residents says, "Well, I bet people are just flushing their Kentucky Fried Chicken down the drains. That's what's causing it." And Mike looked at him and he was like, "Yeah, maybe." And then he just turned around, got in his truck, and he drove away. Early the next morning, Mike and his supervisor came back to Cranley Gardens, and they went around to the side of the building. They undid that cap, and then Mike reached down inside expecting to feel this blockage, but where it should have been, there was nothing. Somebody had cleared the pipes. And so Mike and his supervisor are looking at each other, and Mike is like, "There's no way that cleared on its own. Someone had to have come out here and cleared it, but I don't know why they would have done that and still had us come out." But the men decide, what, maybe by chance it did just kind of slip through and cleared itself. So let's just continue the process and make sure each of the apartment buildings, their individual pipe is unobstructed. And when they checked these pipes, they found all of them were clear except for one, apartment number 23, whose pipe was blocked up with more of this meaty substance. Mike and his partner were already very suspicious of the fact that someone had snuck out here in the middle of the night and cleared the pipe. Probably. They didn't know if that happened, but it seemed likely. And now they're finding more of this weird meat substance coming from a particular apartment. And so the whole situation just seemed off. And so they told the landlord that they were not going to touch this. Somebody else had to come out and deal with this. And the landlord, after finding out there was meat jammed in the pipes, got really freaked out and called the police. The police showed up, they pulled this meat substance out of the pipes, and they sent it to a mortuary where a pathologist looked at it and said, "This is meat. It's human meat." And in particular, the stuff that was pulled out of apartment number 23's pipes is that of a human neck. So the police go back to Cranley Gardens, they go up to apartment number 23, they knock on the door, and when the door opens, they're hit with this overwhelming stench of just rotting flesh. And standing in the doorway of this apartment, the owner of the apartment, is this guy who's in his late 30s, early 40s, who introduces himself as Dennis Nielsen. And they say, "Hey, Dennis, can we have a look around your apartment?" And he says, "Why?" And they say, "Well, we found human remains in your pipes." And Dennis immediately says, "Oh my goodness, I can't believe that. That's horrible." But the police are not buying it. And they say, "You know what, Dennis? Tell us where the rest of the body is." And at this, Dennis suddenly went expressionless, emotionless, and he just turns around and he points into his bedroom and he says, "It's in 2 plastic bags in my closet." And so before the police go into his apartment to go inspect these bags, they say, "Dennis, are there any other bodies in your apartment that we should know about?" And Dennis sighs and he looks up to the ceiling and says, "Yeah, there's about 15 or 16 here. It's a long story. It goes way back. I'd love to tell it to you, get this off my chest, and I'll do it at the police station." So after Dennis was arrested and brought to the station, he told them his horrible story. It had all started 5 years earlier in 1978 when Dennis was 33. He was at a pub having some drinks by himself when a teenager came into the bar and attempted to buy an alcoholic drink, and he was denied service. And so Dennis pulled him aside and said, "Hey, I'd be happy to give you a drink at my apartment. It's right down the road." And the young man, whose name was Steven, was very excited about this and said, "Great, let's go." Once they arrived back and they were up in Dennis's apartment, the pair had lots of drinks and they were having fun and laughing. And then at some point, the pair climbed into bed together. The next morning, when Dennis got up, his new friend, Steven, was still sleeping right next to him. And he had this sudden, overwhelming sense of dread because he knew as soon as Steven woke up, he would see this as a one-night stand and he would just leave. He would not stick around and remain friends with Dennis. And Dennis just did not like that idea. He wanted Steven to stay. And so he looked on the ground next to the bed and he saw the necktie that Steven had been wearing was on the ground. And so he got on the ground, he grabbed the necktie, he fashioned it into a noose, and then he climbed back on the bed, got on top of Steven's chest, and he looped the tie around his neck, and then he pulled it as tight as he could. And as soon as it was tight, Dennis would tell police that Steven came alive, and he began reaching for his neck and kicking Dennis as hard as he could, but he just can't get it off. And at some point, Dennis said Steven just seemed to give up. He looked up at Dennis and knew he wasn't going to get this off and that Dennis was determined to kill him. And so Steven just allowed himself to go limp and then he slouched over. And as soon as that happened, Dennis said he relaxed. But as he's looking at Steven, he realized he wasn't dead. He was just unconscious. And so Dennis goes into the kitchen and he gets this huge plastic bucket and he fills it up with water and he sets it in the middle of his kitchen floor. And then he gets a bunch of kitchen chairs and he lines them up like a table right in front of this bucket of water. And then he drags Steven's body into the kitchen and he lays him on his back on these chairs, but makes sure his head is not resting on the chair. His head is kind of dangling off the back of these chairs. And then he grabbed that bucket of water and he slid it right underneath Steven's head. And then Dennis got on top of the chairs, on top of Steven, and then he pressed the young man's face straight down so his head went backwards until his mouth and his nose were under the water. And Dennis held him like that until Steven regained consciousness, but again, he didn't fight it. He knew he was doomed. And after several minutes, the bubbles stopped coming to the surface and Steven was dead. Dennis pulled his victim off of the chairs. He brought him into the living room and he sat him on a chair. And then Dennis went into the kitchen and he made himself a cup of coffee and he smoked some cigarettes. And then he just stood in the doorway and looked at Steven's body. And he would tell police it was a very bizarre experience because Steven still looked like he was alive. In fact, Dennis would try talking to him as if he was going to talk back, but obviously he didn't. And at some point, Dennis realized, the life he had before he killed Steven was now over. He had a new life and he didn't really know how to handle it. And so the first thing he thought to do was to clean Steven. So he took Stephen's body and he brought him into the bathroom and he gave him a very long bath, cleaned his body, cleaned his hair, and then afterwards he got him out, he dressed him and put him into his bed, and then Dennis climbed into bed with him and laid with him. And he would tell police as he laid there, he suddenly felt overjoyed. Stephen was not going to leave him. He was going to stay here as long as Dennis wanted him to. After laying with him for some time, Dennis realized he had to find a way to hide Stephen's body in his apartment so no one could find him. And so he left his apartment and he went to a hardware store where he got an electric knife and a big storage bin. And he brought them back to his apartment, and as he was about to cut Stephen up, he just couldn't go through with it. So instead, he just climbed into bed and took a nap next to Stephen's body. When he got up again, he moved Stephen's body onto the ground in his living room and covered him with a blanket. And then he went and made dinner and then sat in his chair in the living room right next to this body on the ground and watched TV for a while. When he was done watching TV and eating, he looked at the body on the floor and realized, he really hadn't made any progress in terms of hiding him somewhere in his apartment. And that's when he remembered he had a loose floorboard in his apartment. And so he went over to the loose floorboard, he pulled it up, and he saw there was a space under the floors. And so he pulled a couple more boards up, and then he grabbed Stephen's body and he attempted to force him down into this space. But by now, Stephen's body had begun to stiffen up from rigor mortis. Specifically, his arms were outstretched like a Y over his head. And so as Dennis is trying to force him down in there, his arms were not allowing him to go down into that small space. So Dennis took Stephen's body and he propped him up against the wall in his bedroom. So the body is against the wall, rigid, standing up with its arms up over its head, and Stephen's eyes were still open. And then after that, Dennis just got in bed and fell asleep. So all night, this corpse is staring at Dennis in his bed. And then the next morning when Dennis got up, there was Stephen still up against the wall with his hands in the air looking down at him. Dennis grabbed Stephen's body and put it on the ground, and he began yanking and jerking and pulling on each of Stephen's arms until they were pinned down by his side. And then after that, Dennis started working on his legs and his hips, and he began contorting him until he was small enough that he could pack him down under his floor. And then once he was under there, he just put the boards on top and went about his daily life. And for the next couple of days, he totally forgot about Stephen. But a week after putting him under the floor, Dennis decided he missed Stephen and he wanted to see him again. And so one night he opened up the floorboards, he looked down, and there was Stephen, and Dennis would say it looked like he was dirty. So he pulled him out of the floor and he gave him another bath. And then after he had cleaned Stephen, he pulled him out of the water, he dried him off, and he put him in the chair. And then Dennis took a bath himself in the same water he had just used to clean Stephen. After a long soak in this tub, Dennis finally got out, he toweled himself off, he redressed Stephen, and then he forced him back onto the floorboards and covered him up again. And he would remain there for the next 7 months until Dennis finally decided to dispose of him by burning him in a bonfire outside of their apartment building. And then after the body was completely incinerated and gone, Dennis remembered thinking, I can't believe I just got away with murder. And so he would do it again and again and again, killing at least 15 young men from North London, all by strangulation or by drowning or a combination of the two. And after he killed them, he would keep them stashed in his apartment for months at a time, in his closet, in his cabinets, in his bed, under the floors, all over his apartment. He had these bodies. And while these bodies were in his apartment, he liked to periodically take them out to spend time with them. He would tell police he found corpses to be beautiful. He was fascinated by them. But eventually, in 1983, he had so many bodies stashed all over his apartment that he knew he really needed to expedite getting rid of them. And so he began cutting them up and trying to force them down his drain, which eventually clogged the pipes. And so when Mike the plumber showed up and discovered this meaty substance in the pipes, and Dennis overheard him talking about it, that night after Mike was gone, Dennis had gone outside and attempted to clear the rest of the remains from the pipes. But he wasn't aware there were still remains stuck in the pipe that led to his specific apartment. Dennis Nielsen confessed to killing 15 young men and attempting to kill at least 7 others, and he was sentenced to life in prison. Dennis never showed any remorse, nor did he show any desire to want to be free again. He actually said he deserved to be in jail for what he did. In 2018, Dennis Nielsen would die in prison at the age of 72. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's video, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it, so give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we will pin you at the top of the comment section. If you got something out of today's video and you haven't done this already, the next time you're in a very crowded parking lot and you see the like button driving around looking for a spot, flag them down and point to your parked car as if you're going to leave, and then go over to your car and spend a few minutes fumbling for your keys before just walking away. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya. This story is going to be painful to listen to. It's a horrific tragedy, and there's really no other way to tell it without it coming off that way. And so viewer discretion is advised. But before we get into today's story, if you're a fan of the strange, dark, and mysterious delivered in story format, then you've come to the right place because that's all we do, and we upload 3 or 4 times every week. So if that's of interest to you, please go into the like button's favorite music playlist and replace all of the songs with the Kids Bop version of them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly uploads. All right, let's get into today's story. In the early 1960s, 2 high school classmates in South Carolina named Carol and Reggie fell in love with each other. Every day in the halls, they'd hold hands and they'd laugh with each other and whisper to each other, and then outside of school, they were inseparable. But despite their seemingly perfect relationship, it didn't last long. They both had different ideas about what the future should hold, and so after graduation, they broke up. Reggie went on to join the US Navy, where he served for a number of years all over the world. He would at one point get married, but that marriage would end quickly, and then after he got out of the military, he got a job at a railroad back at his hometown in South Carolina. As for Carol, after graduation, she got married and divorced too, twice actually, but it was her second failed marriage that nearly killed her. On February 18th, 1987, Carol was living with her 10-year-old daughter Rhonda in South Carolina when her estranged second husband came up to the door and knocked. Carol opened the door and her ex-husband drew a gun and shot her 6 times in front of her daughter before turning around and fleeing. The police would later find his body inside of his car on the side of the road. He had shot himself. As for Carol, the doctors were able to save her life, but the injuries she sustained from the attack were crippling. She was blind in one eye and she had chronic pain, and so her young daughter had to start taking care of her full time. Over the next 8 years, Carol steadily improved and regained some of her independence, but in 1995, she had a huge setback. She started feeling ill, and so she went in to see a doctor, and the doctor did a blood test, and they discovered she had liver cancer. It would turn out the blood that was given to her after the attack, that had been transfused into her body to save her life, it had been tainted with hepatitis C. And so she got hepatitis C without realizing it, and because it had been untreated, it led to liver cancer. Rhonda remembers when her mother came home after being given this terrible news, she just sat down and was silent for a minute, and then she just kind of muttered to herself, I just can't get away from this man. He's killing me all over again. But despite being dealt such an unfair hand in life, Carol was determined to not let her injuries or her illness define her. And so she went out looking for a job that could accommodate her physical limitations, and she found it. She was hired as a part-time customer service rep for a television cable company. She was very happy about this job and very proud of it because it was the first time she was working after the attack, and so for once it felt like her life was going back to normal again. A few years later, in 2000, when Carol was working at the cable company, her phone rang and she answered it the way she answered every other call, but the voice she heard on the other end, she immediately recognized. He introduced himself as Reggie Sumner, and so Carol asked him, "Are you the Reggie Sumner from 1962 at Garrett High School in South Carolina?" And he said, yeah, that's me. And Carol said, I'm your ex-girlfriend. We dated in high school. And so it was this incredible reunion, this totally chance phone call. And for the next hour or so, they just chatted on the phone about everything from their kids to their relationships they've been in to what they're up to now. I mean, they had a lot to catch up on since they hadn't seen or heard from each other in nearly 40 years. And so before they hung up, they realized they lived near each other, and so they made plans to get together in person. Rhonda would say her mother, when she came home that night, was like a 16-year-old girl all over again. She talked endlessly about how great Reggie was and how good-looking he was and how excited she was about their upcoming date. And so a couple of days later, Carol and Reggie have this date, and when Carol comes home, Rhonda would say it was obvious her mother had fallen head over heels in love with Reggie all over again. And luckily, Reggie had fallen in love with Carol too, because less than 6 months later, they got married and became Mr. and Mrs. Sumner. Within a year of their marriage, they decided to sell their home in South Carolina and move to Jacksonville, Florida to retire. Even though caring for her mother for all those years had been quite difficult for Rhonda, she said she was very sad to see her mother go, but at the same time, she was really happy for her because it seemed like she had found the one. Over the next couple of years, Rhonda stayed in touch with her mother, speaking to her almost every single day on the phone. But in July of 2005, Rhonda's mother stopped answering her phone. At first, Rhonda wasn't that concerned, but after 24 hours of not hearing from her mother or from Reggie, she did get concerned. Because even though Reggie was able to care for Carol, he wasn't in the best shape himself. He had debilitating diabetes, and he had recently broken his leg, and so was largely confined to a wheelchair. And so if they were to leave their house for an extended period of time, they wouldn't do it without asking for help from Rhonda. And so over the next couple of days, Rhonda incessantly called her mother and called Reggie, but she never got through to them. And so finally, after almost 72 hours of not hearing from them, she decides to just hop in her car and drive the 4 hours to Jacksonville to check on them personally. When she got there, she saw her mother and Reggie's car was not in the driveway like it normally would be. And so Rhonda went up to the front door and she knocked and she's yelling for her mom, but nobody's coming to the door, even though lights are on inside the house. And so Rhonda eventually tries the handle of the door and it's open. And so she opens it up, she steps inside, she yells again for her mom and for Reggie, but no one yells back. And then she sees their beloved dog, Mikey, that they brought everywhere with them, was still in the house. And so she's thinking, where would they have gone without bringing Mikey? And so Rhonda continues to walk through the house into the kitchen. And when she gets there, she sees on the table are 2 plates of food where the food looks like it's a couple of days old and it's just sitting on the plate like they had been eating it and then just abandoned it there. And then in the sink are all these dirty dishes. And then on the stove are half-cooked pots of food. And Rhonda knows her mother is an extremely tidy person and she never would have left her house with dirty dishes and food out on the table. And so red flags are going up for Rhonda. But what ultimately sealed the deal for her was when she turned and looked on one of the counters, she saw the cell phone that Reggie and Carol shared was still sitting there along with Carol's purse. And then next to that was both of their medications, which was Reggie's insulin and Carol's liver cancer medication, both of which were life-saving and needed to be taken every single day. There's no way they would have left the house without those things. And so Rhonda immediately calls the Jacksonville Police Department and she files a missing person report. And before long, the missing couple's story is all over the news and all of the networks are asking people if they have information to come forward, but no one came forward. And so the only lead the police had was to track down the Sumner's car, which was missing from their driveway when Rhonda showed up at their house. So the police shared the description of their vehicle all across the state, and very quickly they got a hit. The car had been found abandoned in a Florida town about 1 hour west of Jacksonville. It had been parked in this semi-forested, very secluded area off of a dirt road, and there was nothing inside of it, but they saw the battery had been taken out, leading some of the officers to speculate that perhaps the Sumners really had just driven away from their home without telling anybody and then ran into car troubles. But that theory would quickly be thrown out the window when 5 hours later, the Jacksonville police received a very strange phone call. The man who called in said he was Reggie Sumner, and he said he had seen the news about him and his wife being missing and that was just totally not true, that in reality they had left, but they were just fine and they'd be back soon. The police are immediately suspicious of this person. They don't think it's it's Reggie Sumner because, for one, he sounds like a young man and Reggie is a 61-year-old. And so the voice didn't really line up. And just the way he was talking about this disappearance like it was no big deal, that also just didn't really make sense. And so one of the officers asked Reggie, "Are you with your wife, Carol?" And he said, "Yep, I'm with her. Here she is." And so a woman hops on the phone who says she's Carol Sumner, but she sounds far too young to be Carol Sumner, who's 61. This sounds like a 18, 19, 20-year-old girl. And she too just reiterates that everything's just fine and they've gone out for a couple of days. There's nothing to worry about. And, you police can stop looking for us. And so after this call ends, the police at this point are convinced that this simply cannot be Carol and Reggie. But to make sure, they call in Rhonda and they have her listen to the recording of this conversation with the so-called Reggie and Carol. And right away, Rhonda says, "That's not my mom and that's not Reggie." And so at this point, the police assumed that these two people who called in pretending to be the Sumners probably had something to do with the disappearance of the real Sumners. And so while they waited for the trace on this phone call to come back, which would give them information about who was calling and from where, the police decided to investigate another angle. The police looked at the Sumners' bank statements and they saw their bank card had been used at an ATM in South Carolina after the Sumners had been reported missing. And so they called that bank and they asked for the CCTV footage from that ATM. And when they watched it, they saw that it was not Carol or Reggie Sumner withdrawing funds. It was some unknown man in his early 20s. Right after this discovery of this unknown man, the trace from the phone conversation with the imposter Sumners came back, except it was tied to a fake name at a fake address. So that wasn't helpful to the police in their investigation. However, when they went through this cell phone's call logs, which they got with the phone trace, they saw whoever owned the cell phone had recently placed a call to a car rental company in South Carolina. And so the police call this car rental company and they speak to the manager and they're able to figure out that somebody using this cell phone number had indeed called and had rented a car, and the car they rented matched the description of the car the unknown man was driving in the ATM surveillance footage. But this car had been rented to a woman. Her name was Tiffany Cole. The rental company told police that all of their cars had satellite tracking information built into them. And so police were able to use that information to track Tiffany's rental car to a motel in South Carolina. The initial thought was that maybe the Sumners are being held against their will in this motel. And so very quickly, a police force was organized, and on the morning of July 14th, so 6 days after the Sumners were listed as missing, they arrive at this motel, they go to the front desk, they find out what room Tiffany is in, they get the key, and they go up and they open the door. The Sumners were not inside. Instead, there were 3 young adults sitting there. It was 24-year-old Tiffany Cole, her boyfriend, 23-year-old Michael James Jackson, and his friend, 19-year-old Alan Wade. Also in the room were dozens of bags of recently purchased merchandise, like computers and video games and clothes and perfume. And also they discovered the key to the Sumners' vehicle and Reggie Sumner's prized coin collection. The police brought all 3 back to the police station and put them in separate rooms to be interrogated. At this point, it was obvious to police that these 3 had something to do with the Sumners' disappearance. They had all these things in the room that tied them to the missing couple. And so now the police, as they interrogated them, it was not so much about connecting them to the Sumners as much as it was about helping them find the Sumners. At first, all 3 of them either didn't talk or were totally uncooperative. But under intense questioning, Tiffany cracked a little bit. She said that they had robbed the Sumners, but nothing more. They didn't do anything else besides rob them. And there had been a 4th person involved in the robbery, 19-year-old Bruce Nixon, who was friends with Alan Wade. Bruce lived nearby, so the police quickly rounded him up and brought him in for questioning. And unlike the other 3, Bruce immediately caved. And the story he told about what happened to the Sumners brought many of the police that were involved in this investigation to tears. He said it all started with Tiffany. Tiffany used to be neighbors with the Sumners back when they still lived in South Carolina. Tiffany had a pretty rough upbringing and her father was permanently sick. And so the Sumners kind of took her under their wing and looked after her and built a very close relationship with her and kind of treated her like she was one of their daughters. Anything she needed, if she needed money, food, anything, they would give it to her. For example, in 2001, right before they left for Florida, they sold a car to Tiffany, but they sold it for basically nothing because they knew she didn't have any money and she really needed a car. 4 years later, in June of 2005, Tiffany was partying in Jacksonville, Florida with her new boyfriend, Michael James Jackson, when they got kicked out of the house they planned on staying in for the night. And so now they don't have a place to stay, they don't have any money, and that's when Tiffany remembers the Sumners had moved to Jacksonville and they would always help her out if she needed anything. And so the two of them drive to the Sumners' house in the middle of the night, they haven't called them, and they just knock on the door, totally uninvited, and Carol comes to the door, and when she opens it, she sees Tiffany, and immediately she's like, "Oh my goodness, I haven't seen you in so long. Come in, come in. Who are you? Oh, Michael, great to meet you. Come on inside. I'll get you food. We'll get you fed. What do you need? What can we do for you?" And so that's when Tiffany explains to them that their plans had kind of fallen through and they didn't have a place to stay that night, and would it be possible to stay with them? And so Carol and Reggie right away say, "Absolutely no problem. Tiffany, Michael, you guys are guests here. You're welcome. Stay as long as you want." And so that night, Carol cooked a big meal for them and they all sat down at the table. And at some point, Carol and Reggie talk about the sale of their house in South Carolina. And somehow it came up that they had made $99,000 in profit from this sale. And they were so happy about it because now they could really retire comfortably. And so as soon as they said that, Tiffany and Michael shot glances at each other because they knew they had to come back and rob them. The next morning, Carol and Reggie got up early, they made coffee and they made breakfast, and they were hoping that Tiffany and Michael would stick around for the day and spend some more time with them. But Tiffany and Michael were very quick to want to leave. They said, "Thank you very much, we got to hit the road." And so they left. And as soon as they get in the car, they start planning how they're going to come back and rob the Sumners and get their hands on that $99,000. 1 month later, on the evening of July 8th, after all robbery preparations have been made, Bruce Nixon and Alan Wade show up at the Sumner house and they knock on the door. When the door opens, it's Carol, and she doesn't recognize either of them, but being as kind and generous as she was, she said, "Hey boys, what can I do for you? How can I help you?" And this was exactly what Bruce and Alan were expecting based on what Tiffany told them. She said this couple would be very easy to exploit. And they tell her that their car had broken down and they needed to use her phone. And so she's a little bit skeptical, but ultimately she says, "Sure, come on in." And so Bruce and Alan go inside the house, the door shuts behind them, and as soon as it does, one of them draws a fake gun that looks very real and pointed it at Carol, while the other one began tying her up with cord and with duct tape. And so Carol begins screaming and making a bunch of noise, and Reggie, who's in the garage out of sight, he hears her. He comes running in to see what's going on, and he sees these two men who immediately attack him, and Reggie's got a broken leg and he's already pretty weak and frail, and so he doesn't put up much of a fight. And before long, he and his wife were all taped up and restrained on the couch, and they were having duct tape wrapped around their heads until everything was covered except for a slit underneath their nose so they could breathe. And so with the couple completely under control and at the mercy of their captors, one of the men texted Michael, who was down the road with Tiffany inside of Tiffany's rental car, and the text just said, "All clear." And what that meant was Michael could now come up and help them rob the house. And so Tiffany stays down the road in the rental car. Michael makes his way up. He goes inside, and he, Bruce, and Alan proceeded to ransack the house. And while these three men are moving room to room, taking all of their valuables, Reggie and Carol are probably thinking to themselves that, you know what, this is awful, we're getting robbed, but after they take whatever they take and they leave, we'll be fine, we'll recover. But when these three men finished taking all of their valuable items, they decided that they would also take Reggie and Carol. So they stood the couple up and they marched them into the garage and they put them in the trunk of their own car. At this point, Bruce left the Sumner's house and went down the road and got in Tiffany's rental car, and Michael and Alan, they got into the Sumner's car, and the two cars met up on the road and then drove 40 minutes northwest just over the border into Georgia, where they found this access road and they went down it until they reached this very secluded section of forest. This was not just some random spot in the middle of the woods in Georgia. This was a pre-selected spot that Tiffany and the others had been out to 2 days earlier to prepare it. And what they had done to prepare was to dig a grave for the Sumners. Michael and Alan, in the Sumners car, drove up right next to the grave site, while Tiffany and Bruce came up right behind them. And once they had all stopped, they got out of the car and they went right behind the Sumners car and they popped open the trunk. It's believed the temperature inside of that trunk was well over 100 degrees. And so Reggie and Carol were sweating profusely, and the sweat had caused their restraints to slip off their wrists and slip down off their face. And so the two of them were found holding on to each other and crying and praying. Seeing how weak they already were, the group decided they did not need to put new tape around their wrists or their face. They weren't going to go anywhere. And so they grabbed the two and they pulled them out and dumped them on the ground. It was probably around this time that the Sumners realized Tiffany was one of these 4 people that was doing this horrible thing to them. And I can only imagine the heartbreak they experienced. This girl that they took in under their wing, that they thought of as a daughter, was betraying them in such a heinous and horrible way. But there was no time to feel upset about it, because as soon as they were dumped on the ground, Michael grabbed Reggie and kind of threw him over to the side and said, "Sit down, don't move, or I'm going to kill you and your wife." And then the others grabbed Carol and dragged her away from her husband over to the edge of the grave, where they literally ripped the jewelry off of her face and off of her body. And then after all the jewelry was gone, they pushed her into the grave. Then they walked over to Reggie and dragged him over and threw him in with his wife. As soon as the couple was in the grave together, they repositioned themselves so they were both sitting up, one in front of the other, with Carol behind Reggie, and she threw her legs and her arms around Reggie, just kind of clutching onto him, and she buried her head into his back and she began crying. The original plan, apparently, had been to take the Sumners and put them in this grave and pretend like you were going to do something to them to scare them into giving up all of their information, all of their banking information, and anything else that was valuable. And it worked. And so as Carol is crying into Reggie's back, Reggie is pleading with the group. He's pleading to them, "Let me give you everything I have. Whatever you need, it's yours." And so Michael said, "Give me all your ATM bank card numbers, give me your PIN numbers, everything." And so Reggie did. He gave him all the information he could possibly give to him. And then, for some reason, despite the fact that at this point, the group has taken everything of value from this poor couple, they have extracted all the valuable information they could possibly get from them. Despite that, they decide that that's not enough. They need to kill the Sumners. And they need to kill them in the worst way imaginable. They need to bury them alive. For hours, the group slowly, shovelful by shovelful, filled in this hole with Reggie and Carol sitting at the bottom begging for their lives. But the group didn't care at all. They just kept shoveling dirt down on top of them until the dirt and mud had gotten up to their necks, and the weight of the dirt was pressing in on their chests and was making it really hard to breathe. And so as Carol and Reggie are feeling this happening to them, they can feel themselves being crushed under this weight. Their cries for help become more and more desperate, but more spaced apart, because their breathing at this point is so labored, it's so hard to get a full breath that they're conserving their air at this point. And then at some point, as the dirt crept closer and closer to their mouths, they had to tilt their heads up to try to get a good breath of air. But when they did that, they began shoveling dirt directly onto their faces, causing them to choke and gag. They're inhaling this, and it's becoming nearly impossible to catch a breath. They're dying at this point. And so finally, another layer of dirt was thrown on top of them, and they disappeared under the soil. But their sounds didn't go away. They continued to whimper and make sounds as more and more dirt was put down, until finally they had filled in the hole, and they began packing the dirt down with the backs of their shovels. And they could hear underneath the soil still the sounds of this couple dying. This was a slow and horrible death. After the killers were done, they left the site and they took the Sumner's car and they dumped it in Florida, where it was ultimately found. And then they all piled into the rental car. They went to an ATM and pulled some of the Sumner's money out, and then went on a spending spree. Here is a photo of Tiffany celebrating just hours after killing the very people that had taken her in and treated her like a daughter. After their autopsies, the medical examiner explained that both Reggie and Carol had dirt packed into their nose, into their mouths, in their throats, in their stomach, and in their lungs, meaning their actual cause of death was being buried alive. In exchange for telling investigators what happened and for leading them to the gravesite where the Sumners were, Bruce Nixon was spared the death penalty and given a life sentence. As for Michael, Allen, and Tiffany, they were all sentenced to death. So that's going to do it, guys. If you found the secret in today's episode, let us know in the comments what it is and where you found it. So give us the timestamp. And if you're the first to do that, we'll pin you at the top of the comments section. If you got something out of today's episode and you haven't done this already, please go into the Like Button's favorite music playlist and replace all of the songs with the Kids Bop versions of them. Also, please subscribe to our channel and turn on all notifications so you don't miss any of our weekly 3 or 4 video uploads. If you want to get in touch with me, you can direct message me on Instagram or on Twitter. My username for both platforms is the same. It's JohnBallen416. I also have a ton of content over on TikTok where my username is MrBallen. I also have a second YouTube channel called MrBallen Shorts where I post random short videos and lost episodes. If you have a story suggestion, please submit it to our subreddit just called MrBallen. It's linked in the description below. So whether I see you on Instagram, Twitter, TikTok, Reddit, YouTube, or some combination, just know that I really appreciate your support. And until next time, that's going to do it. See ya.